Texas wind carried dust and fury that evening, whipping across the plains with a vengeance that seemed almost personal. Beneath a sky bruised purple and black, a lone figure stumbled forward each step, a battle against the storm's rage. The girl's boots, too large for her feet, sank into the softening earth as thunder rumbled overhead, promising worse to come. Josephine Harlan, though she'd been calling herself Jo for months now, clutched her side where a knife had grazed her ribs. Not deep enough to kill, but enough to remind her what men were capable of when drink and hatred mixed in their blood. Her cropped hair, hastily cut with sheep shears months ago, plastered against her forehead as the first heavy raindrops fell. Behind her, shouts carried on the windmen from the Double Diamond Ranch, their voices slurred but determined. The lanterns they carried bobbed like fireflies in the gathering darkness, too close for comfort. "Find that thieving boy!" a voice bellowed. "Nobody steals from Hayes and lives to tell." Jo hadn't stolen anything but her own freedom, slipping away when Gavin Hayes, the ranch foreman, had cornered her in the stables with wandering hands and whiskey breath. The knife she'd used to defend herself had drawn blood, and in these parts that was all the justification needed for a hanging. The pain in her side throbbed in time with her racing heart as she crested a small rise. Through sheets of rain she spotted it, the weathered fence line of the neighboring Whispering Pines ranch. She'd heard whispers about the place, about Old Man Blackwood, who kept to himself about the tragedies that had haunted his family. But haunted or not, it offered shelter from both storm and pursuers. Lightning split the sky, illuminating a small structure ahead, an abandoned stable at the property's edge. With the last of her strength, Jo pushed toward it, her lungs burning, her vision narrowing to a desperate tunnel focused solely on sanctuary. The stable door hung from a single hinge, creaking as the wind caught it. Jo slipped inside, the sudden absence of rain almost disorienting. The smell of old hay and horse filled her nostrils as she collapsed into a corner, pulling moldy blankets over herself. Her blood-slicked fingers left crimson streaks on the fabric. As consciousness began to slip away, Jo thought she heard a soft whisper, not from outside where the men searched, but from deeper within the stable. A woman's voice, gentle but urgent. "Stay strong, little bird. Morning brings new beginnings." Fever dreams, she thought as darkness claimed her. Just fever dreams. Ethan Blackwood had lived 62 hard years, each one etched into the lines of his weathered face. He rose before dawn from habit, not necessity. A lifetime of ranching had set his body's clock to wake with the first hint of light. This morning the air smelled clean after the storm, though evidence of its fury lay everywhere, branches scattered across his property, a section of fence flattened near the creek. He pulled on his boots with a grunt, feeling the protest of aging joints, and stepped onto the porch of the modest two-story house that had been in his family for 3 generations. Nathan Stone, his ranch manager for nearly 30 years, approached from the bunkhouse, his face grave beneath his silver mustache. "Mornin', Ethan. Storm took down the fence by Miller's Creek, and looks like someone broke into the old stable. Might have been drifters." Ethan nodded, his expression unchanged, though his hand instinctively moved to the revolver at his hip. Times were hard and desperate men did desperate things. "I'll check it. You get the boys started on that fence." The walk to the abandoned stable was silent, save for the squish of mud beneath Ethan's boots and the occasional call of awakening birds. The building had once been the pride of Whispering Pines, back when his father ran 50 horses and supplied the cavalry. Now it stood as a reminder of better days, used only for storage and the occasional shelter during bad weather. The door hung awkwardly, and fresh footprints led inside. Drawing his gun, Ethan approached cautiously, years of frontier wisdom making him wary. Rustlers, thieves, or worse could be waiting. What he found instead was a boy, or what appeared to be a boy, curled beneath filthy blankets in the corner. Small, thin, with cropped dark hair and clothes too big for the slight frame. But it was the blood that caught Ethan's attention, a spreading stain on the boy's side, crimson against faded blue cotton. "Hey!" Ethan said gruffly, keeping his distance. "You alive in there?" The figure startled awake, scrambling backward until hitting the wall, eyes wide with fever and fear. A small knife appeared from somewhere, held in a trembling hand. "Stay back," the boy whispered, voice cracking. "I'm just passing through. I'll be gone by noon." Something in that voice made Ethan pause. It was pitched too high for a young man, despite obvious efforts to lower it. And there was something in those wide, frightened eyes that stirred ancient memories, a desperate kind of defiance he'd seen before. "You're bleeding," Ethan said, holstering his gun slowly. "And from the look of you, you've got fever setting in. That knife won't do you much good if infection takes hold. The boy no Ethan was increasingly certain this was no boy swallowed hard knife still raised. I've survived worse. Ethan took a cautious step forward, hands visible. I reckon you have, but you don't have to. Not here. For a moment they remained locked in silence, evaluating each other. Then the youngster's strength seemed to fail, the knife lowering slightly as a wave of pain crossed the pale face. Taking advantage of the moment, Ethan moved quickly, disarming the intruder with a swift motion that spoke of years handling unruly colts and stubborn cattle. What happened next confirmed his suspicions. In the struggle, his hand brushed against bindings beneath the oversized shirt bindings that flattened what nature had given a young woman, not a boy. Their eyes met hers, filled with terror beyond the physical pain. "Please," she whispered, no longer trying to disguise her voice. "Please don't." Ethan stepped back immediately, an unexpected softness crossing his weathered features. "I mean you no harm, girl," he said quietly. "But that cut needs tending and you need food. Whatever you're running from, it won't find you here today." He extended a calloused hand, an offer, not a demand. "Can you walk, or do I need to carry you to the house?" She stared at his hand as if it might turn to a snake. "Why would you help me?" Ethan's gaze drifted momentarily to the stable rafters, as though seeing ghosts among the cobwebs. "Let's just say, I've seen what happens when no one offers help when it's needed most." The main house at Whispering Pines had once been grand by Texas standards, 2 stories of solid construction with a wide porch wrapping around 3 sides. Now, like its owner, it showed signs of enduring hard times with stubborn dignity. Paint peeled from window frames and one of the porch railings had been mended with wire instead of properly replaced. Joe sat at the kitchen table, wrapped in a clean but patched quilt, watching with wary eyes as a plump woman named Martha fussed over a pot of something that smelled better than anything Joe had encountered in months. "Skinny as a fence post," Martha muttered, shooting Joe disapproving glances. "And that haircut with a dull knife, I'll wager." Ethan stood by the window watching the yard where ranch hands moved about their morning chores, seemingly unaware of the visitor in the kitchen. "The cut's not deep," he said, addressing Joe rather than Martha, "but it could have turned bad. You're lucky." Joe's fingers clutched the quilt tighter. "Lucky isn't the word I'd use." "No." A hint of something like amusement touched Ethan's stern face. "What word would you use then?" "Trapped," Joe answered honestly. "Cornered." Martha made a clucking sound, setting a bowl of stew before Joe. "Eat first, philosophy later." The smell was overwhelming after days of near starvation. Joe's hands trembled as she lifted the spoon, pride battling with hunger. Hunger won. She ate carefully at first, then with increasing desperation, until the bowl was empty. "There's more," Martha said, already refilling it. "But slower this time. Your stomach needs to remember how to accept kindness." An odd choice of words, Joe thought, but the woman wasn't wrong. "Now," Ethan said when the second bowl was half emptied, "I reckon it's time for some truth. Your real name isn't Joe, I'd guess." She stiffened. "It is now." "Fair enough. And those men who were chasing you last night from Hayes' outfit, I'm guessing, what did you do to rile them?" Joe set down her spoon, appetite suddenly gone. "One of them, Gavin, tried to... He found out I wasn't..." The word stuck in her throat. Ethan nodded slowly. "I see. And you defended yourself." "I cut him," Joe admitted, chin rising slightly. "Not deep, but men like that don't take kindly to being refused, especially by someone they think deceived them." "No," Ethan agreed, his voice suddenly distant. "They don't." Martha and Ethan exchanged a loaded glance that Joe couldn't interpret. "She needs rest," Martha declared, ending whatever unspoken conversation had passed between them. "The blue room, I think." Ethan nodded. "The blue room." Something in his tone made Joe look up sharply. There was weight to those words, history in them. "I can't stay," Joe protested, even as exhaustion tugged at her limbs. "Those men..." "Hayes and his boys won't cross my fence line," Ethan said with quiet certainty. "There's history there they don't care to revisit. You'll be safe enough for now." As Martha led her upstairs to a small bedroom painted a faded cornflower blue, Joe couldn't shake the feeling that she'd stumbled into a story already in progress, one where her arrival had been somehow expected. Dreams chased Joe through restless sleep, her mother turning away as her father's belt came down the Kentucky hills, disappearing behind her as she fled, Gavin Hayes' face twisted with rage and humiliation. She woke gasping, afternoon sun streaming through muslin curtains. The room was simple but clean, a narrow bed with an iron frame, a washstand with a porcelain basin, a small dresser topped with a tarnished mirror. On a chair by the bed lay clean clothes, men's clothing, but smaller than what she'd been wearing. After washing away the grime of travel and changing, Jo moved to the window. From here she could see much of the ranch corrals containing a modest herd of cattle fields that needed attention, a barn that had once been red but had weathered to the color of dried blood. It was a place holding on by sheer determination, much like herself. A soft knock at the door made her tense. "Yes, it's Martha. Mr. Blackwood would like to speak with you if you're able." Jo found Ethan on the back porch staring at an ancient oak tree that stood alone in a small fenced area some distance from the house. As she approached, she realized it was a tiny cemetery, just 2 graves marked with simple stones. "Feel better?" Ethan asked without turning. "Yes, sir. Thank you for the clothes." He nodded. "They were my nephew's. He outgrew them years ago." Jo stood awkwardly, unsure what was expected. Finally, Ethan turned to face her. "I need to show you something. Then we can decide what happens next." He led her across the yard, past curious glances from ranch hands toward the solitary oak and its small cemetery. The gate creaked as Ethan pushed it open, gesturing for Jo to follow. 2 gravestones stood in the shade, one weathered by decades, the other newer, but still worn by years of sun and rain. Ethan stopped before the newer stone where wildflowers grew in seemingly random patterns. Sarah Blackwood, 1850 to 1872. One who never got to live as herself. Jo's breath caught. The epitaph struck her like a physical blow. Ethan knelt slowly, his knees protesting, and pulled a few weeds from around the stone. "My sister," he said simply. 20 years dead now, but some days it feels like yesterday. Jo remained silent, sensing there was more to come. "Sarah was different, like you." His weathered hand traced the epitaph. "She bound her chest, cut her hair, preferred trousers to dresses. Our father didn't understand, but he loved her too much to cast her out. After he died, I promised to keep her safe." He fell silent, lost in memory. "What happened to her?" Jo finally asked, though something in her already knew the answer. "Official story is she took her own life, drowned herself in the creek during a spring flood." Ethan's voice hardened. "Truth is, she was beaten, left for dead by men who thought they had the right to punish what they didn't understand." A chill ran through Jo despite the afternoon heat. "Why are you showing me this?" Ethan stood, joints cracking, and faced her directly. "Because I want you to understand something. When I found you this morning, I saw her eyes looking back at me, and I thought perhaps God was giving me a second chance to keep my promise." He gestured toward the house. "That blue room was hers. Nobody's slept there since she died. Martha keeps it clean out of respect, but it stood empty. Until today." Jo swallowed hard, unsure how to respond. "Mr. Blackwood." "I'm not offering charity," Ethan interrupted. "Whispering Pines needs workers. You need a safe place. I don't care what name you use or how you dress. I care that you work hard and stay honest with me. That's all." The offer hung between them, weighty with unspoken understanding. "And if those men come looking?" Jo asked. A flicker of something cold passed across Ethan's face. "Let me worry about Hayes and his boys." As they walked back toward the house, Jo felt a strange sensation, like invisible threads connecting her to this place, to the grave beneath the oak, to the blue room waiting for her. Not quite belonging, not yet, but perhaps the beginning of it. "What do you say?" Ethan asked as they reached the porch steps. "Do we have an agreement?" Jo looked back at Sarah's grave, then to the weathered face of the man who had, for reasons she couldn't fully comprehend, offered safety when she expected none. "Yes," she said finally. "We have an agreement." Days stretched into weeks as Jo found her place at Whispering Pines. The work was hard, mending fences, helping with cattle, mucking stalls, but honest. No one questioned her appearance or mannerisms, taking their cue from Ethan's matter-of-fact acceptance. Nathan Stone, the ranch manager, initially kept his distance, watching Jo with thoughtful eyes. He was tall and lean despite his 70 years, with a silver mustache that concealed most of his expressions. But when Jo single-handedly repaired a broken wagon axle that had stumped 2 other hands, Nathan's reserve began to thaw. "You've got a knack," he commented, inspecting her work. "Where'd you learn that?" "My grandfather was a wheelwright." Jo said, the truth slipping out before she could stop it. "He taught me before he died." Nathan nodded, a flicker of approval in his eyes. "Good skill to have. We can use that here." It was the closest thing to welcome she'd received from him, and somehow it meant more than Martha's motherly fussing, or Ethan's gruff acceptance. The ranch itself seemed to be holding its breath, maintaining a precarious balance between survival and surrender. Joe counted 8 ranch hands besides Nathan, fewer than such an operation would normally employ. The cattle were healthy but numbered perhaps 200 head, a fraction of what the land could support. One evening, as sunset painted the western sky in shades of fire, Joe found Ethan on the front porch staring at his land with an expression she'd come to recognize, part pride, part worry. Without invitation, she settled onto the step below his rocking chair, knees drawn to her chest. They sat in companionable silence as the light faded, listening to the chorus of cicadas and the occasional lowing of cattle in distant pastures. "It must have been something to see," Joe said finally, "when all this was at its height." Ethan's chair creaked as he rocked slowly. "It was. My father ran 3,000 head and 50 horses. The house was always full, guests, family celebrations. Sarah used to play piano in the parlor, while my wife Margaret arranged flowers." It was the first time he'd mentioned his wife, Joe realized. Another grave beneath the oak. "What happened?" she asked, then quickly added, "If you don't mind telling." Ethan was quiet so long that Joe thought he wouldn't answer. Then as the first stars appeared overhead, he spoke. "War happened, drought happened, oil happened, and grief happened." The simple words contained volumes. Joe nodded, understanding more than he'd actually said. "But it's still here," she offered. "Still standing." "Yes." Something softened in Ethan's voice. "Still standing." They lapsed into silence again, but it was a different quality of silence, now less lonely somehow, as if they'd each recognized something familiar in the other's determination to endure. As darkness settled fully over the land, Joe noticed Ethan staring at the moon rising over the eastern hills. "Red moon," he murmured. "Blood on the horizon. Storms coming." Whether he meant weather or something else entirely, Joe couldn't tell. But that night she dreamed of Sarah Blackwood, not as a victim, but as a woman standing tall beneath the oak tree, beckoning Joe toward something she couldn't quite see. The first real test of Joe's place at Whispering Pines came 3 weeks after her arrival. She was working with the horses, an area where she'd shown natural talent. Animals responded to her in a way that had raised eyebrows among the hands. "Never seen Diablo let anyone near his blind side," Nathan had commented, when Joe easily approached the temperamental gelding that had injured 2 men the previous spring. "It's like you speak their language." Joe had only shrugged, uncomfortable with the attention. Truth was, animals made more sense to her than people ever had. They judged by action, not appearance. She was brushing Diablo in the corral when hoofbeats approached from the east, 3 riders coming fast. Joe recognized the lead horse immediately, a distinctive Palomino belonging to Gavin Hayes. Her hand instinctively moved to the knife at her belt as she stepped into the shadow of the barn. Ethan emerged from the house as the riders pulled up in a cloud of dust. He stood on the porch, one hand resting casually near his holstered revolver. "Hayes," he acknowledged coldly, "you're on Whispering Pines land." Gavin Hayes was 28, with the hard eyes of a much older man. Handsome in a cruel way, with a scar bisecting his right eyebrow that he wore like a badge of honor. Today he also sported a healing cut along his jawline, Joe's handiwork. "Blackwood," Hayes returned with false cordiality. "Just being neighborly. Lost one of our hands a few weeks back, young fella, dark hair about this tall." He held his hand at shoulder height. "Thought maybe you'd seen him." From her hiding place, Joe could see Ethan's expression remain unchanged. "Can't say that I have. Plenty of drifters passing through, though. Hard times make people restless." Hayes' smile didn't reach his eyes. "This particular drifter stole from me. Cut me too." He touched his jaw. "I owe him a conversation about manners." "That's so." Ethan's voice remained neutral. "Well, if I see anyone matching that description, I'll be sure to point them toward Double Diamond. Though I have to wonder why you're so determined to find one drifter in particular." One of Hayes' companions shifted uncomfortably in his saddle. "Boss, maybe we should—" "Quiet, Tom." Hayes never took his eyes off Ethan. "I don't like thieves, Blackwood. And I don't like liars either. Word is you've taken on new help recently." Tension crackled between the men like heat lightning. Joe's fingers tightened around her knife handle. "My hiring practices aren't your concern, Hayes," Ethan said evenly. "Just like what happened to the Barlow place isn't my concern." Hayes stiffened at the reference. The Barlow ranch, Joe had heard, had been foreclosed upon the previous year, its water rights mysteriously diverted just before a crucial bank inspection. "Ancient history," Hayes said, but his smile had faltered. "Maybe," Ethan agreed. Or maybe Judge Reynolds would find it interesting reading if someone were to send him those documents Sarah kept. It was a bluff, Joe was almost certain, but something in Hayes' expression changed at the mention of Sarah and the judge. A flicker of uncertainty quickly masked. "You're an old man protecting a dying ranch, Blackwood," Hayes said, voice hardening. "Be careful whose toes you step on." "And you're a young man with a short memory," Ethan replied. "Your father knew when to back down. You'd do well to learn that lesson before someone teaches it to you the hard way." For a moment, Joe thought Hayes might draw the pistol holstered at his hip. Instead, he spat on the ground between his horse and the porch. "Enjoy your declining years, old man. Things change, even boundaries." With that, he wheeled his horse and rode off, his men following. Joe waited until the dust had settled before emerging from the shadows. Ethan still stood on the porch watching the horizon where the riders had disappeared. "He knows I'm here," Joe said quietly. Ethan nodded. "He suspects, but he won't cross me, not directly. There's too much history." "What documents were you talking about? What did Sarah keep?" A shadow crossed Ethan's face. "Nothing that exists anymore. But Hayes doesn't know that. His father was one of the men who—" He didn't finish the sentence. "And Judge Reynolds, is he connected somehow?" Reynolds was supposed to investigate Sarah's death, called it suicide without viewing the body. His son Mason runs the bank now, the one foreclosing on half the county. Ethan's eyes hardened. "Like I said, history." That night, Joe lay awake in Sarah's blue room, piecing together the fragments of a story that seemed to surround her like a half-heard whisper. Whatever had happened 20 years ago hadn't ended with Sarah's death. It lived on in Ethan's determination to keep the ranch, in Hayes' veiled threats, in the careful way Nathan and Martha exchanged glances whenever certain names were mentioned. And now somehow Joe was part of that unfinished story. The discovery about Ethan's illiteracy came by accident a month into Joe's stay at Whispering Pines. She found him in his study one evening holding a letter with a troubled expression. "Bad news?" she asked from the doorway. Ethan looked up startled, then folded the paper quickly. "Nothing for you to worry about." But Joe had already glimpsed the official letterhead of the Oak Ridge County Bank and the red stamp marked "Final Notice" across the front. "Is the ranch in trouble?" she asked directly. Ethan's jaw tightened. "Ranches are always in trouble these days. Cattle prices down, costs up. Nothing new under the sun." Joe hesitated, then took a chance. "Do you want me to read it for you?" The letter. A flash of something, anger, pride, shame, crossed his weathered face. For a moment she thought she'd overstepped catastrophically. Then, with deliberate care, Ethan extended the folded paper. "You've sharp eyes," he said quietly. "And I suppose there's no hiding it anyway. Never learned my letters properly. Sarah used to read for me. Then Margaret. After that," he shrugged. "Nathan helps when he must, but I don't like to ask more than necessary." Joe unfolded the letter, scanning its contents quickly. The formal language couldn't disguise the brutal simplicity of its message. Whispering Pines Ranch had 60 days to repay a loan of $3,000 or foreclosure proceedings would begin. $3,000, she said softly. "By end of July." Ethan nodded, unsurprised. "About what I figured. The drought 2 years ago hit us hard. Had to sell off half the herd at rock-bottom prices just to feed the rest. Took a loan to rebuild, but cattle prices never recovered. The sum was staggering, more money than Joe had ever seen. What will you do? What I've always done. Keep working. Keep hoping." Ethan reclaimed the letter, folding it with precise movements. "One day at a time is all any of us are promised." That night began a new ritual. After supper, Joe would join Ethan in his study, reading aloud from letters, newspapers, and occasionally, when the day's news had been digested, from books Sarah had collected. Ethan never commented on this arrangement, but he never failed to be in the study after supper waiting. It was during one of these evening sessions, 3 days after the bank letter, that Joe first learned about the oil. She had been reading from the county newspaper a tedious account of a town council meeting when Ethan interrupted. "Skip to the back page. There's usually a market report." Joe obliged, flipping to the final page where commodity prices were listed. "Cattle prices still down," she noted. "Cotton holding steady. Oh, oil is up again. Says there's a new strike down near Austin." Ethan grunted, but something in his tone made Joe look up. He was staring out the window toward the creek that marked Whispering Pines' eastern boundary. "There's oil in Texas," he said as if speaking to himself. "Always has been. Indians used it for medicine long before white men came. Used to seep up through the ground in places." Joe set the paper aside, sensing a story coming. 10 years ago, big companies started sending men around, surveyors they called themselves, offering to lease land for exploration. Ethan's eyes remained fixed on the darkening land outside. One came here, slick fellow from Pennsylvania, said there were promising signs on the east section by the old creek bend. Where Sarah's favorite spot was, a voice said from the doorway. Nathan stood there, his tall frame silhouetted against the hallway lamp. Where she used to sit and sketch for hours. Ethan nodded. The same. Man offered $500 for exploration rights. Said there could be thousands more if they struck oil. Did you take it? Joe asked. A bitter smile touched Ethan's mouth. No, sent him packing. Told him Whispering Pines wasn't for sale or lease, not 1 acre. Nathan stepped into the room, settling his lanky frame into a chair by the cold fireplace. That's when the trouble started. Trouble. Ethan and Nathan exchanged a long look, some unspoken communication passing between them. Accidents, Nathan said finally. Cattle found dead, fences cut. Stream diverted one summer so our south pasture dried up. Nothing that could be proven as deliberate. But you knew, Joe guessed. We knew, Ethan confirmed. Same way we know who was really responsible for what happened to Sarah, despite what the official record says. The pieces were starting to fit together in Joe's mind. Sarah's death, the oil company's interest, the ongoing struggles of the ranch, the bank's sudden pressure. Judge Reynolds, she said slowly, the one who ruled Sarah's death a suicide. Is he connected to the bank, the one foreclosing now? His son Mason runs it, Nathan provided. Judge died 5 years back, but the son's cut from the same cloth, and that cloth is oiled through and through. Ethan rose abruptly, moving to a cabinet in the corner. He withdrew a bottle of whiskey and 3 glasses, pouring modest measures and passing them around. To Sarah, he said, simply raising his glass. Who saw clearer than any of us? Nathan lifted his glass. To Sarah. Joe completed the triangle, raising her own glass. To Sarah, she echoed, though the woman remained a mystery shaped by others' memories. As the whiskey burned down her throat, Joe felt the invisible threads binding her to this place grow stronger. The story she'd stumbled into was larger and older than she'd imagined, with roots that went deeper than she could see. And somehow she knew her own story was now inextricably entwined with it. The dream came again that night, more vivid than before. Sarah Blackwood standing beneath the oak tree beckoning. But this time, there was urgency in her gesture, as if time were running short. Joe woke before dawn, drenched in sweat despite the cool night. Something pulled her from bed, drawing her to the window that overlooked the small cemetery. Moonlight silvered the landscape, casting the oak's shadow long across the graves. For an instant, just the blink of an eye, Joe thought she saw a figure standing there, pale as the moonlight itself. Then it was gone, if it had ever been there at all. Unable to return to sleep, Joe dressed and slipped downstairs. The house was silent, except for the regular tick of the grandfather clock in the hallway. Outside, pre-dawn air wrapped around her like cool silk as she made her way toward the oak tree. The gate creaked softly as she entered the small cemetery. Sarah's grave looked undisturbed, wildflowers nodding gently in the breeze. Beside it, the older stone marked Margaret Blackwood's resting place. What are you trying to tell me? Joe whispered, feeling foolish for addressing the dead, yet compelled to do so. Only silence answered the breathless hush before dawn, when the world seemed balanced between yesterday and tomorrow. As the first pale light touched the eastern horizon, Joe turned to leave. That's when she saw it, a corner of white protruding from beneath a flat rock at the base of the oak tree. She might never have noticed in full daylight, but against the shadows it stood out like a beacon. Kneeling, Joe moved the rock and discovered a small metal box, rusted with age but intact. Her heart quickened as she lifted it, lightweight, but definitely containing something. The clasp was corroded shut, resisting her initial attempts to open it. Finding things that ain't meant to be found. The voice nearly stopped Joe's heart. She whirled to find Nathan standing at the cemetery gate, his expression unreadable in the half-light. I was just... she stammered, clutching the box guiltily. Nathan pushed the gate open and approached, his movements deliberate. Joe braced herself, expecting anger or accusation. Instead, he knelt beside her, his old joints protesting audibly. Been wondering if anyone would ever find that, he said quietly, nodding at the box. Sarah put it there the week before she died. Told me about it, made me swear not to tell Ethan unless absolutely necessary. Joe looked from Nathan to the box and back again. What's in it? Truth, Nathan said simply. At least Sarah's version of it. But truth can be dangerous, especially when powerful men have built lives on its absence. He reached out his gnarled hands, working the clasp with practiced patience until it gave way with a soft click. Inside lay a small leather-bound journal and what appeared to be several letters tied with faded ribbon. Her diary, Nathan explained, and correspondence that certain parties would prefer had burned with her other possessions. "Does Ethan know about this?" Nathan shook his head. "Sarah made me promise, said it would only put him in danger if he knew. She wanted him protected." The old man looked toward the house, now golden in the rising sun. "But maybe it's time. With the bank closing in and Hayes getting bold again, maybe it's time for the truth to have its say." He closed the box and pressed it into Joe's hands. "Read it first, alone, then decide whether Ethan should see it." "Why me?" Joe whispered. "Why not you?" Nathan stood brushing dirt from his knees. "Because you sleep in her room. Because you wear clothes like she did. Because she led you here same as she led you to the box." Before Joe could question this strange statement, Nathan turned and walked away, leaving her alone with Sarah's secrets cradled in her hands, secrets that somehow she sensed were about to change everything. The journal and letters revealed a story both simpler and more complex than Joe had imagined. Sarah Blackwood had indeed been different, as Ethan described, but there was more. She had been in love, a secret, impossible love for Sophia Reynolds, the judge's daughter. The letters spanning 3 years told of clandestine meetings, desperate longing, and plans constantly deferred. Sophia, it seemed, lacked Sarah's courage to defy convention. While she returned Sarah's feelings, she remained trapped in her role as a banker's daughter, betrothed to a suitable young man from Austin. Sarah's journal entries grew increasingly bitter as their relationship frayed under the strain of secrecy. The final entries hinted at confrontation. Sarah had threatened to expose their relationship publicly if Sophia went through with her marriage. There was mention of evidence she had gathered against the judge and certain business associates, evidence of illegal dealings related to land acquisition and oil rights. The last entry, dated 3 days before her death, read simply, "I will not live a lie any longer. If truth destroys us all, so be it. At least I will have lived honestly for once." Joe closed the journal, her mind racing. If what Sarah had written was accurate, she had been murdered, not simply for being different, but because she threatened to expose corruption that reached to the highest levels of county government and business. And that corruption, it seemed, lived on in the person of Mason Reynolds, Sophia's husband, and now president of the bank foreclosing on Whispering Pines. The sound of approaching footsteps startled Joe from her thoughts. She quickly hid the box beneath her bed as a knock came at her door. "Joe, you in there?" It was Martha, her voice urgent. "Yes, come in." The door opened to reveal Martha's worried face. "There's a man here from the bank, and he's brought the judge with him." "Judge?" Joe asked, confused. "I thought Judge Reynolds was dead." "Judge Taylor," Martha clarified. "New circuit judge, Reynolds' protege. They're in the parlor with Mr. Blackwood now. Nathan sent me to find you, said you should be there." Heart pounding, Joe followed Martha downstairs. In the parlor, a room rarely used since Joe's arrival, sat Ethan, his face like stone, across from 2 men in expensive suits. One was younger, perhaps 40, with the smooth, well-fed look of someone who had never worked with his hands. The other was older, gray-haired and portly, with the florid complexion of a man who enjoyed his whiskey. "Ah, here's the young man now," the older one said as Joe entered. "Blackwood's new helper." Ethan's eyes flashed a warning to Joe. "This is Joe Harlan," he said evenly. "Joe, this is Judge Taylor and Mr. Mason Reynolds from the bank." Joe nodded stiffly, recognizing the names from Sarah's journal. Mason Reynolds, Sophia's husband, the son of the judge who had covered up Sarah's murder. "Mr. Harlan," Mason Reynolds said, his smile not reaching his eyes. "A pleasure. I understand you've made quite an impression here at Whispering Pines. Ethan rarely takes to newcomers." There was something in his tone that raised Joe's hackles, a hint that he knew more than he was saying. "Mr. Blackwood is a fair employer," Joe replied carefully. "I'm grateful for the opportunity." Judge Taylor harumphed impatiently. Yes, very touching. Now, Blackwood, as I was explaining, the bank's position is quite clear. The loan is due in full by July 31st. Given your history of late payments, they're not inclined to offer extensions." Ethan's face remained impassive. "And as I was explaining, Judge, this history coincides precisely with 3 years of manipulated cattle prices and mysterious accidents that have affected only Whispering Pines and no other ranch in the county." Mason Reynolds spread his hands in a gesture of innocence. "The market affects everyone, Mr. Blackwood. It's hardly personal." "Isn't it?" Ethan's voice was dangerously soft. An uncomfortable silence fell. Joe could feel the weight of history in the room, decades of enmity compressed into this single confrontation. Perhaps, Mason said finally, there could be an alternative arrangement. The east section of your property has certain features that might make it valuable to investors I represent. A sale of just that portion could satisfy the debt and leave you the remainder of the ranch. Ethan's hands tightened on the arms of his chair. The east section, where the creek bends, where Sarah used to sit. A sentimental attachment, I understand, Mason said smoothly, but sentimentality is a luxury few can afford in these difficult times. Something in Joe snapped at the casual cruelty of his tone. You mean the section with oil? She said bluntly. The section your father-in-law's associates tried to lease 10 years ago before the accident started. All eyes turned to Joe in shocked silence. Mason's face hardened, the mask of civility slipping for an instant to reveal something cold beneath. You have quite an imagination, young man, he said finally, and perhaps too loose a tongue for your own good. Joe, Ethan said quietly, please ask Martha to bring coffee for our guests. It was a dismissal, but Joe recognized it as protection, not rejection. Ethan was removing her from a dangerous situation. As she left the parlor, Joe caught a final exchange between the men. You should be careful about the company you keep, Blackwood. Mason's voice drifted after her. Some associations can be unhealthy. Funny, Ethan replied evenly. Sarah used to say the same thing about the Reynolds family. In the kitchen, Martha was already preparing coffee, her movements sharp with tension. Those men, Joe said quietly, they're the ones, aren't they? Connected to what happened to Sarah. Martha's hands stilled on the coffee pot. What do you know about that? Enough, Joe answered. I know enough to understand why Ethan will never sell that land, and why they want it so badly. Martha studied Joe's face for a long moment, then nodded slightly. Nathan showed you her things, didn't he? I told him it was time. Before Joe could respond, a crash came from the parlor, followed by raised voices. They rushed to find Ethan standing over Mason Reynolds, who had fallen backward in his chair. Judge Taylor was attempting to intervene, his face purple with indignation. Will not be threatened in my own home, Ethan was saying, his voice shaking with rage. Mason scrambled to his feet, straightening his jacket with affected dignity. It was merely an observation, Blackwood, about your unusual household arrangements. People talk, you know, about young men who aren't what they seem. The threat was unmistakable. Mason's eyes slid to Joe, a cruel smile playing at his lips. I believe our business is concluded for today, he continued. The bank's terms remain as stated. Payment in full by July 31st or foreclosure proceedings will commence. As the men departed their buggy, raising dust in the yard, Ethan remained standing in the parlor, his face ashen. He knows, Joe said quietly. About me. Ethan nodded. Hayes must have told him. They're connected business partners in some ventures, I believe. I'm putting you in danger by staying, Joe realized aloud. Just like Sarah did. No. Ethan's response was immediate and forceful. Sarah wasn't dangerous because of who she was. She was dangerous because of what she knew. And now it seems you know it too. Their eyes met in silent understanding. Whatever storm was coming, they would face it together, bound by Sarah's secrets, by shared danger, and by the fragile trust that had grown between them. That evening, as sunset painted the sky in shades of fire and blood, Joe joined Ethan on the porch again. They sat in silence, watching darkness claim the land they both now fought to protect. I found her journal, Joe admitted finally, and the letters. Nathan showed me where to look. Ethan didn't seem surprised. I always suspected she kept records. Sarah was thorough that way. She loved someone, Joe said carefully. Sophia Reynolds. A soft sigh escaped Ethan. I knew there was someone. Sarah would disappear for hours, come back with a light in her eyes I didn't understand. I never asked. Maybe I should have. Sophia married Mason after Sarah died. They have a daughter, Eleanor. Ethan nodded slowly. I've seen her in town. Dark hair like her mother. Sad eyes. They lapsed into silence again, but it was a silence filled with new understanding of the past of each other, of the forces arrayed against them. What will you do? Joe finally asked. About the bank. The deadline. Ethan's gaze remained fixed on the distant horizon where the first stars had begun to appear. What I've always done, he answered. Fight for what's mine, for what's right. His eyes shifted to Joe's face, searching. The question is, what will you do? It was a fair question. Joe could leave, disappear into the vastness of Texas, or beyond, start fresh somewhere new. It would be the sensible choice, the safe choice. Instead, she thought of Sarah's grave beneath the oak tree of the blue room that had become her sanctuary of the land that seemed to whisper to her in the language of wind and grass. She thought of Ethan Blackwood, who had offered shelter when she expected none, who fought alone against forces that had already taken so much from him. "I'll stay," Joe said simply, "as long as you'll have me." Something flickered in Ethan's weathered face, relief, gratitude, perhaps even a shadow of hope. "Then we'll face whatever comes," he said, extending his hand. Joe took it, feeling calluses that mirrored her own, the mark of lives shaped by work and struggle and perseverance. In that handshake was a promise unspoken, but binding. Neither would abandon the other, whatever storm approached on the horizon. As darkness settled fully over Whispering Pines, Joe thought she saw a pale figure standing beneath the distant oak, watching, waiting, perhaps approving. Then it was gone like mist before morning sun, leaving only questions and the certainty that the real battle was just beginning. The summer heat descended on Whispering Pines like a physical weight, pressing down on land and inhabitants alike. By mid-June, the creek that marked the ranch's eastern boundary had shrunk to a languid ribbon, and cattle clustered in the sparse shade of cottonwoods. In the shimmering distance, dust devils danced across parched pastures, harbingers of the drought that ranchers across Texas feared might come. For Joe, the heat brought new routines. She rose before dawn when the air still held night's coolness, completing the heaviest work before the sun climbed too high. Afternoons were spent in the relative comfort of the barn, mending tack, or helping Nathan with endless repairs to equipment that, like Whispering Pines itself, seemed held together by stubborn determination more than anything else. The bank's deadline, July 31st, hung over the ranch like a gathering storm cloud. Though Ethan never mentioned it directly, Joe could see it in the tightening around his eyes, in the way he studied the cattle with calculating gaze in his increasingly long evenings spent on the porch, staring at the distant horizon as if answers might materialize from the Texas sky. Joe had taken to reading Sarah's journal each night, piecing together the story of a woman she'd never met, but whose life had become inexplicably entwined with her own. The similarities between them were uncanny, not just in how they dressed or presented themselves, but in their fierce independence, their refusal to bend to others' expectations. But where Joe had fled from confrontation, Sarah had charged toward it. Her final journal entries revealed a woman determined to expose corruption regardless of personal cost, a crusader whose courage ultimately proved fatal. "Would you have done it differently?" Joe whispered one night, tracing the final entry with her fingertip. "If you'd known what it would cost." No answer came from the silent pages, but sometimes in dreams Joe thought she heard Sarah's voice, urgent, insistent, guiding her toward some revelation just beyond her grasp. The discovery of oil came not through dreams or intuition, but through Diablo, the temperamental gelding that had formed an unlikely bond with Joe. She had taken to riding him during evening checks of the property's boundaries, a task Nathan had entrusted to her after witnessing her skill with the difficult horse. The eastern section, the land Mason Reynolds so coveted, was wilder than the rest of the ranch, with limestone outcroppings and scrub oak thickets breaking the rolling prairie. The creek bend, where Sarah had spent so much time, was a natural oasis shaded by ancient cottonwoods whose roots reached deep enough to find water even in the driest seasons. It was there during a particularly sweltering evening that Joe dismounted to let Diablo drink. While the horse quenched his thirst, she wandered along the creek bank, thinking of Sarah sitting in this same spot, perhaps writing the very journal entries Joe had been reading. A gleam in the water caught her eye, an iridescent sheen on the surface near the bank. At first she thought it might be dragonfly wings catching the light, but as she knelt for a closer look, she realized it was something else entirely, a slick rainbow-hued film spreading from a seep in the creek bank. Heart racing, Joe dipped her fingers into the water, rubbing them together. They came away slick with a substance that couldn't be anything but oil. "So it's true," she murmured. "It's really here." The implications hit her like a physical blow. This wasn't just about land or cattle anymore. The substance coating her fingers represented power that could save Whispering Pines or destroy it, depending on whose hands controlled it. A snapping twig pulled her from these thoughts. Joe whirled to find a man watching her from the shadow of a cottonwood, Mason Reynolds, his expensive suit incongruous against the wild backdrop. "Mr. Harlan?" he said smoothly, though his eyes glittered with something predatory. "What a pleasant surprise." Joe straightened, wiping her hands on her trousers as casually as possible. "Mr. Reynolds, You're on Whispering Pines land. Am I the boundary markers are so faded these days? I was simply enjoying an evening constitutional. His gaze shifted to the creek, then back to Joe's hands. Fascinating spot, this bend. The indigenous people believed it had special properties. My geologists have similar theories, though, of a more scientific nature. Joe said nothing, standing her ground as Reynolds approached. He moved with the confidence of a man accustomed to deference, stopping uncomfortably close. You know, Mr. Harlan, I've been making inquiries about you. Curious thing, no one seems to recall a young man of your description from Kentucky. But there are whispers of a girl who disappeared around the same time you appeared in Texas. A chill ran through Joe despite the evening heat. I don't know what you're talking about. I think you do. Reynolds' voice dropped to a near whisper. Just as I think you know what's beneath this land, what Blackwood is too stubborn or too sentimental to exploit. He reached out suddenly, grabbing Joe's wrist and turning her hand palm up to reveal the oily residue still clinging to her fingers. Evidence that could save that pitiful excuse for a ranch, yet he'll let it rot before he'll drill. For what loyalty to a dead sister who was an abomination in the eyes of God and decent society? Anger flared hot in Joe's chest. Let go of me. Or what? Reynolds' grip tightened. You'll cut me like you cut haze that might work with drunk cowhands, but I assure you the consequences would be rather different with me. Before Joe could respond, Diablo reared up behind Reynolds, his massive form casting a sudden shadow. The banker released Joe's wrist, stumbling backward as the horse pawed the air threateningly. Call off your beast, Reynolds demanded, genuine fear replacing his smugness. Joe made a subtle clicking sound, and Diablo settled, though he continued to glare at Reynolds with what seemed like unmistakable contempt. You should leave, Joe said quietly, before my beast decides you're a threat. Reynolds straightened his jacket, attempting to recover his dignity. This isn't over, Harlan, or whatever your real name is. Blackwood can't protect you just like he couldn't protect his sister. Some secrets are too dangerous to keep. As he retreated toward where his own horse was tethered, he called back over his shoulder. Tell Blackwood he has until the end of the month. After that, this land and whatever's beneath it belongs to people who know its true value. Once Reynolds was gone, Joe's legs gave out. She sank to the creek bank, shaking with delayed fear and anger. Diablo nudged her shoulder gently as if offering comfort. Thank you, boy, she whispered, stroking his velvet nose. Looks like we both recognize a snake when we see one. The ride back to the ranch seemed longer than usual, weighted by the knowledge Joe now carried. The oil was real valuable enough that Reynolds would threaten and intimidate to get it, and somehow he knew or strongly suspected Joe's true identity. The question now was what to do with these dangerous truths. Nathan was waiting in the barn when Joe returned, his weathered face reflecting the sunset's glow through the open door. He took one look at her expression and nodded grimly. You found it then, he said. It wasn't a question. Joe dismounted, beginning to unsaddle Diablo with hands that still trembled slightly. You knew all along. Known for years, Nathan confirmed. Sarah found it first back before anyone thought much about oil in these parts. Showed it to me, made me promise not to tell Ethan unless absolutely necessary. Why keep it secret from him? Nathan leaned against a stall door, his tall frame stooped with the weight of years and secrets. Sarah knew what would happen if word got out. Knew the kind of men it would bring. Men like Judge Reynolds who'd take what they wanted by any means necessary. Men like his son Mason, Joe added quietly. I met him at the creek tonight. He knows about the oil, and he knows about me, or suspects at least. Alarm flashed across Nathan's face. He threatened you. More or less. Said Ethan couldn't protect me just like he couldn't protect Sarah. Nathan's expression hardened. History repeating itself. That's what they want. He pushed away from the stall, decision crystallizing in his eyes. Time to show Ethan the journal. All of it. Tonight. Joe nodded, feeling a strange mixture of relief and dread. I'll get it from my room. As she headed toward the house, the setting sun cast her shadow long across the yard, stretching toward the oak tree and its small cemetery as if drawn by invisible threads to the past buried there. For an instant, Joe thought she saw another shadow moving alongside her own, matching her stride for stride. Then it was gone, leaving only the certainty that tonight would change everything. Ethan's face remained impassive as he turned the pages of Sarah's journal, his weathered fingers surprisingly gentle with the fragile paper. They sat in his study, Ethan behind the desk, Joe and Nathan standing like sentinels on either side, Martha hovering in the doorway, unwilling to participate, yet unable to leave. The silence stretched, broken only by the occasional rustle of pages turning and the steady tick of the grandfather clock in the hallway. Outside, a summer storm was building, distant thunder echoing like artillery across the plains. When Ethan finally spoke, his voice was hollow with grief, freshly unwrapped. All this time, she was carrying this burden alone. Not entirely alone, Nathan said quietly. She had Sophia. Sophia Reynolds. Ethan's tone hardened on the name. Who married her lover's persecutor within a year of her death. We don't know the whole story there, Joe ventured. Sarah's last entry suggests Sophia was afraid of her father, afraid of scandal, afraid enough to let Sarah die. The bitterness in Ethan's voice was palpable. Afraid enough to marry into the family that murdered her? No one had an answer for that. Lightning flashed through the window, illuminating the room in stark white before plunging it back into lamplight shadows. Ethan closed the journal, finally placing it with deliberate care on the desk before him. And the oil, you found it where Sarah described? Joe nodded. At the creek bend. Just a seep, but definitely there. Mason Reynolds found her there tonight, Nathan added. Made threats. Hinted he knows Joe's secret. A muscle twitched in Ethan's jaw, the only outward sign of his anger. So the wolves are circling. Deadline still 6 weeks away. Why show themselves now? Because they're afraid, Martha said suddenly from the doorway. All eyes turned to her as she stepped fully into the room, her normally placid features set with resolve. Afraid of what else Sarah might have left behind. Afraid of what Joe might have found. Evidence, Joe realized aloud. Sarah mentions gathering evidence against Judge Reynolds and his business associates. Mason must think I found it. Have you? Ethan asked sharply. Joe shook her head. Just the journal and letters. If there was more, it wasn't in the box Nathan showed me. Nathan straightened, something like hope kindling in his eyes. But there could be more. Sarah was meticulous. If she claimed to have evidence, she had it. Thunder crashed directly overhead as if punctuating his statement. Rain began to patter against the windows, quickly intensifying to a downpour. We have 6 weeks, Ethan said, rising from his chair with newfound purpose. 6 weeks to find whatever Sarah hid, if it exists. 6 weeks to save this ranch. He moved to the window, staring out at the rain-lashed darkness. And in the meantime, Joe doesn't ride alone. Not anywhere, but especially not to the east section. Reynolds and Hayes are desperate men, and desperate men are dangerous. I can take care of myself, Joe protested, though Reynolds' threatening grip on her wrist was still fresh in her memory. Ethan turned, fixing her with a gaze that brooked no argument. Sarah said the same thing. I won't lose another person. He stopped abruptly, emotion making his voice rough. I won't have another death on my conscience. Not while I draw breath. In that unfinished sentence hung something neither of them was ready to acknowledge, a connection that had grown beyond employer and worker, beyond protector, and protected into something familial and fiercely devoted. We'll start searching tomorrow, Nathan said, practical as always. Sarah's favorite places first. As the meeting broke up, the storm reached its crescendo, wind howling around the eaves of the old house like a living thing. Joe paused at the door to the study, looking back at Ethan, who had returned to staring out the window, his profile etched in lightning flashes. She'd be proud, you know, Joe said softly, of how you fought for this place, for her memory. Ethan didn't turn, but his shoulders straightened almost imperceptibly. It wasn't enough to save her, but it might be enough to save her legacy, Joe countered, and to bring justice finally. Later, lying in Sarah's blue room as the storm gradually subsided, Joe found herself thinking of Sophia Reynolds, who had loved Sarah, but lacked the courage to stand beside her. What pressures had bent her to her father's will? What threats had forced her into marriage with Mason? And what of Eleanor, their daughter? Did she know anything of her mother's past, of the woman whose death had preceded her birth by such a short time? These questions circled in Joe's mind as sleep claimed her, following her into dreams, where Sarah and Sophia stood hand in hand beneath the oak tree, their faces blurred by rain or tears, their voices lost in the whisper of wind through branches. The storm broke the heat wave, leaving behind mud and renewal. Grass that had yellowed under the relentless sun brightened to emerald, and cattle scattered across revitalized pastures. It was as if the land itself had taken a deep breath, allowing everyone at Whispering Pines a moment's respite from worry. The search for Sarah's hidden evidence began methodically. Nathan, Joe, and Ethan combed the east section near the creek, looking for any sign of where she might have concealed documents. Martha searched the house, examining floorboards, checking behind picture frames, tapping walls for hollow spaces. Days passed with nothing to show but muddy boots and increasing frustration. Whatever Sarah had hidden, if indeed she had hidden anything at all, remained elusive. Maybe it was just a bluff, Joe suggested one evening as they gathered in the kitchen after another fruitless day. Something she wrote to frighten them but never actually had. No, Ethan said with quiet certainty. If Sarah said she had evidence, she had it. She never made idle threats. Martha set down a platter of cornbread with unusual force. We're thinking too complicated. Sarah was smart, yes, but practical. She wouldn't hide something where it might never be found. She hid her journal where it took 20 years to find, Nathan pointed out. No, Martha countered. She told you where it was. She wanted it found just at the right time by the right person. Her eyes shifted meaningfully to Joe. The implication hung in the air. Joe was somehow the right person chosen across decades to continue what Sarah had begun. The thought was both flattering and terrifying. Tomorrow, Ethan decided, we try a different approach. Instead of searching for something hidden, we follow Sarah's last days, trace her steps, see where they lead. It was a new direction, and with the bank's deadline drawing ever closer, they clung to it like drowning people to driftwood. The breakthrough came not from searching, but from an unexpected visitor. Joe was working with Diablo in the corral the next morning when the sound of an approaching buggy drew her attention. It was a fine vehicle out of place in the working environs of Whispering Pines, black lacquered wood with gleaming brass fittings pulled by a matched pair of bays that spoke of money and careful breeding. A woman sat at the reins, young, perhaps 35, dressed simply, but in fabrics that cost more than a ranch hand's monthly wage. Dark hair was pinned beneath a modest hat, and as she drew the buggy to a halt, Joe caught a glimpse of eyes that seemed vaguely familiar. Nathan emerged from the barn, wiping his hands on a rag. "Can I help you, ma'am?" The woman scanned the ranch yard, her gaze settling briefly on Joe before addressing Nathan. "I'm looking for Mr. Blackwood. Is he available?" "Depends who's asking." Nathan replied, his tone neither hostile nor welcoming. "Eleanor Reynolds." The name fell like a stone in still water, creating ripples of tension. "Though I'd prefer if my husband didn't know I was here." Joe and Nathan exchanged glances. Eleanor Reynolds, Sophia's daughter, Mason's wife, the connection between past and present that neither had expected to materialize on their doorstep. "I'll fetch him," Nathan said after a moment's consideration. "Joe, see to Mrs. Reynolds' horses." As Nathan disappeared toward the house, Joe approached the buggy, taking the reins Eleanor offered. "Fine animals," Joe commented, stroking one bay's sleek neck. "My father-in-law's," Eleanor replied, her voice cultured but with an underlying tension. "One of the few things of his I can borrow without too many questions." Up close, the resemblance was clearer. She had Sophia's eyes as glimpsed in the single photograph tucked into Sarah's journal. But there was something else in her face, a determination that reminded Joe of the journal's descriptions of Sarah herself. "You're the new hand," Eleanor observed. "The one people in town are talking about." Joe stiffened. "People talk too much." A ghost of a smile touched Eleanor's lips. "Yes, they do, particularly about things that frighten them." Before Joe could respond, Ethan appeared from the house, his expression carefully neutral as he approached the buggy. "Mrs. Reynolds," he greeted with formal courtesy. "This is unexpected." Eleanor gathered her skirts, accepting Joe's offered hand to descend from the buggy. "Mr. Blackwood, forgive the intrusion. I've wanted to speak with you for some time, but circumstances, well, they're complicated." "So I imagine." Ethan gestured toward the house. "Perhaps we could talk inside, the sun's getting high." As they moved toward the house, Joe made to lead the horses to the water trough, but Eleanor paused, looking back. "Mr. Harlan should join us," she said with quiet authority. "What I have to say concerns him too." Ethan hesitated, then nodded. "Joe, once the horses are seen to." Inside, Martha had hastily prepared coffee and set out her best china, chipped at the edges but still bearing traces of gold leaf from more prosperous days. They gathered in the rarely used parlor, the same room where Mason and Judge Taylor had delivered their threats weeks earlier. Eleanor sat with perfect posture on the edge of a faded settee, her hands folded in her lap. She waited until Martha had served coffee and withdrawn before speaking. "I'll be direct, Mr. Blackwood. I know about Sarah, about her and my mother." The statement hung in the air, blunt and unadorned. Ethan's face remained impassive, though his knuckles whitened around his coffee cup. "How?" he asked simply. "Letters. My mother kept them hidden in a compartment in her writing desk. I found them after she died 5 years ago." Eleanor's voice softened. "She never stopped loving Sarah, you know. Never." Even through 25 years of marriage to my father. Ethan set his cup down carefully. Yet she married him, the son of the man responsible for Sarah's death. Eleanor nodded, pain flickering across her features. She did. I don't pretend to understand or justify her choices, but I know she suffered for them every day of her life. Why are you telling us this now? Joe asked, unable to contain her curiosity. Eleanor turned to her, those familiar eyes suddenly intense. Because history is repeating itself, Mr. Harlan. Because my husband has become his father and my father-in-law before him, and because I refuse to be complicit in another tragedy. From her reticule, she withdrew an envelope, placing it carefully on the table between them. My husband plans to take this land by any means necessary. The oil beneath it represents a fortune he's already spent in his mind. He's made arrangements with Judge Taylor to expedite the foreclosure, regardless of whether you meet the bank's deadline. Ethan's expression darkened. That's illegal. So was what happened to Sarah, Eleanor replied evenly. The law is flexible for men with money and influence. She tapped the envelope. Inside is proof of their arrangement correspondence between my husband and the judge, discussing how to ensure Whispering Pines falls into bank ownership regardless of your actions. It won't stop them, but it might slow them down. Give you time. Time for what? Ethan asked. To find what Sarah hid. Eleanor's gaze moved between them. The evidence she gathered against Judge Reynolds and his associates. The real reason she was killed. Joe leaned forward. You know about that. My mother told me stories never directly about Sarah, but about a friend who discovered terrible secrets and paid the ultimate price. It wasn't until I found the letters that I understood who that friend was and what those secrets might be. Eleanor's composure slipped slightly, revealing the strain beneath. When I heard rumors about you, Mr. Harlan, about your nature and your connection to Whispering Pines, I knew I had to act. History can't be allowed to repeat itself. Do you know what the evidence was? Ethan asked. Or where Sarah might have hidden it? Eleanor shook her head. My mother never knew the details. Sarah protected her by keeping her ignorant, but she did mention one thing that might help: a place they used to meet in secret. A cave near the creek bend, hidden behind a fall of stones. She said Sarah called it their sanctuary. Joe and Ethan exchanged glances. They had searched the creek area thoroughly, but found no cave. We'll find it, Joe said with more confidence than she felt. Eleanor rose, smoothing her skirts with practiced grace. I should go. Mason will be looking for me if I'm gone too long. She hesitated, then added, Be careful, both of you. My husband is not a man who accepts defeat graciously, and he has Hayes watching this property, reporting your movements. As they walked her back to the buggy, Eleanor paused, looking at the oak tree and its small cemetery in the distance. Is that where she's buried? She asked softly. Ethan nodded. Would you like to visit before you go? A complex emotion crossed Eleanor's face, longing mixed with fear. I can't, not today, but someday. Someday I'd like to pay my respects to the woman my mother loved. As Joe helped her into the buggy, Eleanor caught her hand, holding it a moment longer than necessary. Be on your guard, Mr. Harlan. Hayes has been asking questions about a girl who disappeared from Kentucky. Questions that lead in your direction. With that warning, she took up the reins and drove away, leaving behind the envelope and a new sense of urgency that hung in the air like the promise of another storm. The cave, when they finally found it 3 days later, was easy to miss, a narrow opening behind a tumble of limestone at the base of a small bluff overlooking the creek bend. It would have remained hidden if not for a flash flood caused by the recent storm, which had shifted some of the concealing rocks. Nathan discovered it, calling Joe and Ethan with a shout that echoed across the small canyon. They scrambled down the bluff, hearts racing with anticipation. It's tight, Nathan warned, indicating the narrow entrance. And I'm too old for crawling through crevices. One of you younger folks will have to go. Joe volunteered without hesitation, taking a lantern from Ethan's hands. The opening was indeed tight, requiring her to turn sideways and squeeze through a gap barely wide enough for her slender frame. Inside the cave opened slightly, not enough to stand, but sufficient to crouch uncomfortably. The air was cool and damp with the earthy scent of undisturbed soil. Joe raised the lantern, its light revealing a small natural chamber, perhaps 6 feet across at its widest point. At first she saw nothing unusual, just stone and soil, and the remnants of old leaves blown in during previous seasons. But as she moved the lantern methodically, something caught her eye, a dark rectangle protruding slightly from the cave's rear wall. Heart pounding, Joe crawled forward, brushing away dirt to reveal a small metal box similar to the one that had contained Sarah's journal, but larger. It had been embedded in the cave wall, sealed with a mixture of clay and stone that had hardened over time. With trembling fingers, Joe worked it free, surprised by its weight. Unlike the journal's box, this one was secured with a small padlock. "I found something," she called back through the narrow entrance. "A metal box locked." Crawling backward through the tight opening proved more difficult than entering, but adrenaline lent Joe strength and flexibility. She emerged breathless, clutching the box to her chest, face smudged with dirt but eyes bright with triumph. Ethan took the box reverently, turning it in the sunlight. The padlock was good quality but old, its mechanism likely stiffened by years of disuse. "Nathan, your pocket knife," he requested. Using the blade's tip and leverage from the knife handle, Ethan worked at the lock with patient determination until it finally yielded with a rusty click. They gathered close as he lifted the lid, revealing contents that made Joe's breath catch: a stack of documents yellowed but preserved by the cave's dry interior, and beneath them, a small leather pouch. "Let's take it back to the house," Nathan suggested, glancing at the sun. "It'll be dark soon, and this needs proper examination." The ride home passed in tense silence, each lost in thoughts of what Sarah's box might contain, hopes, fears, and the weight of a 20-year quest for justice. Martha was waiting on the porch, alerted by their early return. Her eyes widened at the sight of the mud-covered box clutched in Ethan's hands. "You found it," she whispered, crossing herself in an unconscious gesture. "Maybe," Ethan cautioned. "Let's see what's inside before we celebrate." In the study, they spread the contents carefully across Ethan's desk. The documents proved to be a mixture of handwritten notes, official-looking papers bearing county seals, and several maps marked with annotations in Sarah's neat script. Joe, who had become adept at deciphering Sarah's handwriting through hours spent with her journal, examined the notes first. "These are records of meetings," she explained, scanning quickly, "between Judge Reynolds and representatives of the Eastern Texas Oil Consortium. Dates, locations, amounts discussed." She looked up, eyes wide. "Bribes, Ethan." She documented systematic bribery of officials to secure oil rights. Nathan spread out one of the maps. "Look here, she's marked properties that were foreclosed upon, then acquired by shell companies connected to the consortium, all along a line where they suspected oil deposits. Including the Barlow place," Ethan noted, pointing to a familiar property boundary, "and the Wilson Ranch, both foreclosed under suspicious circumstances." Martha opened the small leather pouch, spilling its contents onto a clear space on the desk. Several gold coins clinked against the wood, followed by a man's signet ring bearing an ornate R design. "Judge Reynolds' ring," Ethan breathed, recognition dawning. The one he always wore, the one he was supposedly buried with. "Proof he was at the creek that night," Nathan said grimly. "Proof he was present when Sarah died." The final item from the pouch was a folded piece of paper that Martha carefully opened. It was a letter, the handwriting different from Sarah's, more flowing, educated, feminine. "It's from Sophia," Joe realized, reading over Martha's shoulder. Her voice caught as she deciphered the words. It's a confession. She witnessed her father and several men, including Gavin Hayes' father, confronting Sarah at the creek. She saw them beat Sarah, saw her fall into the floodwaters. She was too afraid to intervene, too afraid to report what she'd seen afterward. A heavy silence fell over the room as the full implication sank in. Here was proof not just of corruption, but of murder. Proof that implicated not only the long-dead Judge Reynolds, but potentially others still living, including Gavin Hayes' father and whoever else had been present that night. "This is what Sarah died for," Ethan said finally, his voice rough with emotion. "This truth. And it's enough to save Whispering Pines," Nathan added pragmatically. "Reynolds and Taylor will back off once they know we have this." Joe wasn't so sure. "Or it might make them more desperate. This doesn't just threaten the oil deal, it could mean prison for some scandal for others." "Joe's right," Martha agreed. "These men have spent 20 years thinking themselves safe. Cornered animals are the most dangerous." Ethan gathered the documents carefully, returning them to the box. "We need legal protection. Someone outside Reynolds' influence who can ensure these reach the proper authorities if anything happens to us." "Eleanor Reynolds," Joe suggested. "She's already taking risks to help us, and she has access to Mason's circles that we don't." Ethan nodded slowly. "We'll need to get a message to her discreetly. In the meantime, these don't leave the house, and we double the night watch. No one rides alone no matter what." As they dispersed to their evening duties, Joe lingered in the study, touching the signet ring that represented the physical connection between past crimes and present danger. "We found it, Sarah," she whispered. "Now help us use it without history repeating itself." The opportunity to contact Eleanor came sooner than expected. 2 days after finding Sarah's evidence, Joe rode into town with Nathan for supplies, a routine trip made tense by their newfound knowledge and the weight of Ethan's warnings to remain vigilant. Oak Ridge was a modest county seat, one main street lined with false-fronted buildings, a courthouse anchoring one end and the combined railway station and telegraph office the other. Between stretched the usual businesses, a general store, a barber who doubled as dentist, a small hotel, the bank that held Whispering Pines' fate in its ledgers. Their first stop was Mercer's General Store, where Nathan engaged the proprietor in careful conversation while Joe gathered the items on Martha's list. Through the store's wide front windows, the bank was visible across the street, an imposing brick structure with Oak Ridge County Bank chiseled above Greek-inspired columns. As Joe collected sacks of flour and coffee, a familiar figure emerged from the bank, Eleanor Reynolds, accompanied by a young maid heading toward the millinery shop 2 doors down from Mercer's. "Nathan," Joe murmured, nodding subtly toward the window. "Mrs. Reynolds." The old ranch manager followed her gaze, then nodded almost imperceptibly. "Finish up here. I'll settle with Mercer. Then we'll see about those new work gloves you needed." It was a plausible excuse to visit the shop adjacent to the millinery, close enough for an accidental encounter without raising suspicions. 10 minutes later, Joe browsed leather gloves in Watson's Dry Goods, while keeping one eye on the millinery's entrance through the connecting doorway. When Eleanor emerged from the back room where hats were fitted, Joe deliberately moved to create a minor collision in the shared doorway. "Pardon me, ma'am," Joe apologized, using the moment to press a folded note into Eleanor's gloved hand. "Clumsy of me." Eleanor recovered smoothly, tucking the note into her reticule without missing a beat. "No harm done. Do watch where you're going next time, young man." Their eyes met briefly, understanding passing between them, before Eleanor continued on her way head high, the perfect picture of a banker's wife completing routine errands. The note was simple: evidence found. Need legal protection. Can you meet courier at Westline Shack tomorrow noon? Joe completed the purchase of work gloves, then rejoined Nathan outside. They were loading supplies into the wagon when a commotion further down the street caught their attention, raised voices, and the sound of breaking glass from the direction of the saloon. "Trouble," Nathan muttered. "Let's finish up and head back." Before they could complete their task, the saloon doors burst open, disgorging a knot of struggling men onto the boardwalk. At the center of the fracas was Gavin Hayes, his face flushed with whiskey and rage, grappling with a cowhand Joe didn't recognize. "Say it again!" Hayes was shouting. "Say it to my face, you son of a bitch!" The other man, bleeding from a split lip, spat blood onto the dirt. "Everyone knows it's true. Your daddy was Judge Reynolds' attack dog, did his dirty work for years." The words sent a chill through Joe. This was no ordinary barroom brawl. It was directly connected to Sarah's evidence to the past they'd just unearthed. Hayes landed a vicious punch that sent the other man sprawling. "My father was a respected rancher. You watch your filthy mouth." The sheriff emerged from his office, moving to break up the fight. Joe turned to Nathan, alarm evident in her eyes. "Someone's talking," she said quietly, "about Reynolds and Hayes' father, about their connection." Nathan's weathered face tightened. "And I'd wager Mason Reynolds isn't happy about it. Come on, we need to get back. Now." As they drove the wagon out of town, Joe couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. A glance over her shoulder confirmed it. Gavin Hayes stood in the street, staring after them with undisguised malice, blood still dripping from his scraped knuckles. The road back to Whispering Pines suddenly seemed very long and exposed. Night fell over the ranch, bringing with it an oppressive stillness that seemed to heighten every sound: the creak of the windmill, the lowing of cattle in distant pastures, the call of a hunting owl. Joe stood on the porch, scanning the darkness beyond the circle of lantern light that spilled from the house windows. The day's events in town had left everyone on edge. Nathan had doubled the night watch, positioning men at strategic points around the ranch house and barn. Ethan had cleaned his rifle and positioned it by the front door, loaded and ready. Sarah's evidence box sat on Ethan's desk, its contents replaced and locked once more. Tomorrow, assuming Eleanor agreed to their plan, those documents would finally fulfill their purpose, bringing justice for Sarah and saving Whispering Pines, if they made it until tomorrow. "Can't sleep," Ethan's voice came from the doorway behind Joe. She shook her head. Too much on my mind. Ethan joined her at the porch, railing his presence solid and reassuring. For a long moment, they stood in companionable silence, listening to the night sounds of the ranch. 20 years, Ethan said finally. 20 years I've lived with the official lie of how my sister died. Lived with knowing the men responsible were walking free, prospering even. Joe glanced at his profile, silvered by moonlight. You never stopped fighting for her, for this place. Fighting, yes, but not winning. A hint of bitterness crept into his voice. Not until you came. The simple statement carried weight beyond its words. Acknowledgement of how Joe's presence had changed the course of events had perhaps been the catalyst needed to finally bring Sarah's truth to light. I ran, Joe admitted softly. When trouble found me in Kentucky, I ran. When Hayes discovered me at Double Diamond, I ran again. Sarah was braver than I am. Ethan turned to face her fully. You stopped running when you found this place. When you found... He hesitated, then finished simply, home. The word hung between them, laden with meaning. Home, a concept Joe had almost forgotten, had stopped allowing herself to yearn for. Is that what this is? She asked, voice barely above a whisper. Home, if you want it to be. Ethan's response was equally quiet, yet somehow it filled the night around them. Whatever happens tomorrow, whatever comes after, you have a place here, Joe, for as long as you want it. Something tightened in Joe's chest, an emotion too complex to name. Before she could form a response, a flicker of movement caught her eye, a shadow detaching itself from the darkness near the barn, moving with purpose toward the house. Ethan saw it too, his hand moving instinctively toward the pistol at his hip. But the tension eased as the figure resolved into Nathan, returning from a check of the perimeter. All quiet, he reported as he mounted the porch steps. Boys are alert, no sign of trouble. Let's keep it that way, Ethan replied. Joe, you should try to sleep. Tomorrow will be a long day. Sleep, however, proved elusive. In Sarah's blue room, Joe found herself standing at the window, drawn by some instinct she couldn't name. The oak tree and its small cemetery were visible in the moonlight, the stones pale against the shadows. And there, just for an instant, Joe thought she saw a figure standing beneath the spreading branches. A woman in a long dress, her posture both expectant and somehow sorrowful. Then the night breeze shifted the oak's branches, moonlight and shadow rearranged themselves, and the figure was gone, if it had ever been there at all. We're close, Sarah, Joe whispered to the empty air, so close to setting things right. As if in response, the breeze carried the soft scent of wildflowers through the open window, the same flowers that grew on Sarah's grave. It was probably imagination, Joe told herself, yet she drew comfort from it nonetheless. Tomorrow, one way or another, a 20-year journey toward justice would reach its conclusion. And perhaps then Sarah could truly rest, and those she'd left behind could finally move forward. With that thought, Joe returned to bed, falling into a dreamless sleep deeper than any she'd known since arriving at Whispering Pines. A healing sleep preparation for whatever challenges the new day would bring. Outside, the night watch continued their rounds, alert for danger, but seeing only the peaceful Texas night, unaware that events had already been set in motion that would bring the past crashing into the present with unstoppable force. The storm was coming not of rain and lightning this time, but of truth and consequence long deferred. By this time tomorrow, nothing at Whispering Pines would be the same, and in the small cemetery beneath the oak, wildflowers swayed in a breeze that seemed to whisper with a woman's voice, "Be ready, be strong, the reckoning is at hand." Dawn broke over Whispering Pines with deceptive tranquility, painting the eastern horizon in washes of gold and coral that belied the tension humming through the ranch. Joe had risen before first light, unable to remain in bed with anticipation and worry tangling in her chest like barbed wire. The metal box containing Sarah's evidence sat on the kitchen table, their talisman, their weapon, their hope. Ethan had decided it should go with Joe to the line shack meeting with Eleanor, reasoning that Joe could move faster if trouble arose, could hide more effectively in the rugged terrain than his aging frame would allow. "You're sure about this?" Joe asked as Martha packed a saddlebag with food and a canteen. "Me taking it alone," Ethan's weathered face set with determination. "Nathan will ride with you to the halfway point, then circle back to watch the road from town. You'll approach the line shack from the south ridge where you can see anyone coming." He handed Joe his spare revolver, a well-maintained Colt that felt surprisingly heavy in her hand. "Just in case." Joe checked the cylinder, 6 rounds, all chambers loaded. "I'm not much with a gun." "Point and pull if you have to," Ethan said firmly, "but run first if there's trouble. The evidence is what matters. Nathan appeared in the doorway, his tall frame silhouetted against the brightening day outside. Horses are ready. We should move before it gets much lighter. Joe secured the box in a saddlebag, then buckled Ethan's revolver around her waist. It felt foreign, like playing at being someone she wasn't. Then again, perhaps that feeling had defined most of her life. As she moved toward the door, Ethan caught her arm. His eyes, normally guarded, held an emotion that made Joe's throat tighten. "Be careful," he said softly. "The ranch needs you back in one piece." The unspoken message beneath the words was clear. "I need you back." Joe managed a quick nod, unable to speak past the sudden lump in her throat. Martha pressed a small cloth bundle into Joe's hand. "For luck," she whispered. Inside was a pressed wildflower from Sarah's grave and a small carved wooden horse, crude but recognizable, clearly made by a child's hand. It was Sarah's. She carved it when she was 8, carried it everywhere. Joe tucked the bundle carefully into her shirt pocket, close to her heart. "I'll bring it back safe." Outside, Diablo waited, stamping impatiently. The big horse had become Joe's trusted companion, his temperamental nature mellowing only for her. Nathan was already mounted on his sturdy bay, scanning the horizon with the vigilance of a man who had survived frontier life through constant awareness. No words were exchanged as they rode out, the first rays of sun warming their backs as they headed west toward the distant line shack that marked Whispering Pines' boundary with unclaimed scrubland. The mission before them required focus, not conversation. Behind them, Ethan remained on the porch until horse and riders disappeared over the first rise, his hand resting on the rifle propped against the wall beside him. Then he turned and went inside to begin the longest wait of his life. The West Line shack was barely more than a shelter, a single room of rough-hewn logs with a stone fireplace built decades earlier, when Whispering Pines' boundaries had stretched farther, and cowboys needed refuge during bad weather or night herding. Now it stood as a lonely sentinel, visited perhaps twice a year when fence lines were checked. Joe approached cautiously from the south ridge as planned, leaving Diablo concealed in a stand of scrub oak. The vantage point gave clear views of the surrounding terrain, the dusty track that served as a road, the rolling prairie broken by occasional limestone outcroppings, the thin ribbon of a seasonal creek now reduced to scattered pools. No sign of Eleanor Reynolds or her buggy, no sign of anyone. Joe checked the sun's position a little before noon. She was early, deliberately so, better to secure the ground before the meeting. The line shack's interior was dim after the bright sunlight outside. Dust motes danced in the single shaft of light from the small window, revealing a simple plank table, 2 three-legged stools, and a narrow cot against the far wall. A rusted coffee pot sat cold in the fireplace, abandoned after some cowhand's long-ago meal. Joe set the evidence box on the table, then positioned herself by the window where she could watch the approach from town. The revolver was a comforting weight against her hip, though she prayed she wouldn't need to use it. Minutes stretched into an hour. Eleanor was late. Joe fought rising concern, eyes constantly scanning the horizon for any movement, ears straining for the sound of approaching hooves or wheels. When the sound finally came, it wasn't from the direction of town, but from the west, multiple horses moving fast. Joe's heart leaped to her throat as she grabbed the evidence box and moved quickly to the door, peering around the frame. 5 riders crested a rise, a quarter-mile distant, dust billowing behind them. Even at this distance, Joe recognized the lead rider's distinctive Palomino, Gavin Hayes, with 4 of his men. Somehow they had known about the meeting. Somehow they had circled around to approach from the unexpected direction. Joe didn't hesitate. Clutching the box to her chest, she sprinted for the scrub oak where Diablo waited. There was no time to mount properly. She threw herself across the saddle, scrambling into position as the big horse crow-hopped in surprise. "Go!" Joe urged, heeling Diablo into motion just as the first shout went up from Hayes's men. "There by the trees!" Joe hunched low over Diablo's neck as the horse stretched into a gallop, heading east toward Whispering Pines. The saddlebag with the box thumped rhythmically against her leg, a constant reminder of what was at stake. A gunshot cracked behind them, the bullet whining harmlessly overhead. Then another closer. Hayes and his men were in pursuit, gaining ground on fresher horses. The terrain worked against Joe, open prairie, offering little concealment, forcing her to ride straight and fast rather than elude her pursuers through trickery. Diablo ran valiantly, responding to Joe's desperate urging, but the distance between pursued and pursuers steadily narrowed. "Stop, you thieving bitch!" Hayes's voice carried on the wind. "There's nowhere to run." The knowledge that Hayes knew her true identity sent a fresh surge of fear through Joe. This wasn't just about the evidence anymore, it was personal, a chance for Hayes to avenge his wounded pride. Ahead, the land dipped toward a dry creek bed lined with cottonwoods, the first real cover since the line shack. If she could reach it, maybe she could lose them long enough to circle back toward the ranch. Diablo leaped down the bank, hooves sliding on loose shale. Joe clung to his mane, the evidence box clutched awkwardly under one arm. They plunged into the relative darkness beneath the cottonwoods, Joe steering Diablo upstream against the direction her pursuers would expect. The strategy bought precious minutes. By the time Hayes and his men clattered down into the creek bed, Joe had found a game trail leading back up the opposite bank and into a maze of limestone ridges that offered multiple hiding places. The sound of confused voices echoed behind her as the men realized their quarry had vanished. Joe urged Diablo to a sheltered hollow between two rock formations, then dismounted, pressing herself against cool stone as she fought to steady her breathing. "Spread out," Hayes's voice commanded. "She's here somewhere, $500 to the man who finds her." Hoofbeats scattered in different directions as the men complied. Joe closed her eyes briefly, mind racing through options. She couldn't outrun them, not with their fresher horses. Couldn't fight them, not 5-1. Her only hope was to hide until dark, then make her way back to the ranch. But what about Eleanor? Had she been intercepted as well? Was she safe, or had Hayes somehow forced the information about the meeting from her? The questions multiplied, none with answers. All Joe knew with certainty was that Sarah's evidence had to reach Ethan, had to be protected at all costs. A horse nickered nearby, too near. Joe froze, one hand moving instinctively to the revolver at her hip. Through a gap in the rocks, she could see one of Hayes's men dismounting, rifle in hand, scanning the ground for tracks. Diablo shifted nervously beside her, sensing her tension. Joe stroked his nose, willing him to remain quiet. The slightest sound would give away their position. The man moved closer, bending to examine something on the ground. His head lifted, gaze sweeping toward Joe's hiding place. For a heart-stopping moment, she thought he'd seen her. Then a shout from elsewhere drew his attention. "Over here, I found something." The man remounted quickly, spurring his horse toward the voice. Joe exhaled shakily, the momentary reprieve allowing her to think more clearly. She couldn't stay hidden forever. Eventually, they would find her trail. She needed a different strategy, one that ensured the evidence reached safety, even if she didn't. With trembling fingers, Joe opened the box and removed Sarah's journal, the maps, and Sophia's letter, the most damning items. These she folded carefully and tucked into her shirt. The remaining documents went back into the box, which she secured in Diablo's saddlebag. "Listen, boy," she whispered, pressing her forehead against the horses. "You need to go home now. Home to Ethan." She removed her neckerchief and tied it to Diablo's bridle, a signal Ethan would recognize. Then with a sharp slap to the horse's flank, she sent him galloping away from the hiding place, heading toward Whispering Pines. The sudden movement drew immediate attention. Shouts went up as Hayes's men spotted the horse. "There he goes! After him! Where's the rider?" Joe pressed deeper into her rocky shelter, listening as hoofbeats thundered after Diablo. With luck, they would focus on catching the horse with its precious cargo, giving her time to escape on foot. It wasn't much of a plan, but it was the only one she had. Ethan paced the porch of Whispering Pines like a caged predator, pausing only to scan the horizon before resuming his restless movement. It was well past noon. Joe and Eleanor should have returned hours ago. Nathan, who had ridden back to report Joe's safe arrival at the halfway point, now stood at the corral gate, his own concern evident in the rigid set of his shoulders. "Something's wrong," Ethan said, tension evident in his voice. "They should have been back by now." "Could be Eleanor was delayed," Nathan offered, though his expression suggested he didn't believe it. "Or they're being careful, taking a roundabout route." Both men knew these were comforting fictions. Something had gone wrong. "I'm riding out," Ethan decided, moving toward the barn. "You stay here in case they return." Nathan didn't argue. He simply inclined his head, understanding the need for action over continued waiting. Ethan had just finished saddling his horse when the sound of approaching hooves brought both men alert. A single horse coming fast from the west. They moved as one to the yard, rifles ready, uncertain whether to expect friend or foe. Relief washed over Ethan as Diablo came into view, but it quickly turned to dread as he realized the horse was riderless. Joe's neckerchief fluttered from the bridle like a distress signal. "God in heaven," Nathan murmured, his weathered face paling. "What's happened?" Ethan caught Diablo's reins, quickly checking the horse for injuries. Finding none, he turned to the saddlebags, discovering the metal evidence box still secured inside. She sent the horse back deliberately, he realized aloud, with the evidence. His eyes lifted to the horizon where Diablo had appeared. She's out there somewhere, in trouble. Nathan was already moving toward the bunkhouse to rouse the ranch hands. We'll find her, Ethan. No, the words stopped Nathan in his tracks. Not we, just me. The rest of you need to defend the ranch. Hayes isn't a fool. He'll have men watching, waiting for us to leave it unguarded. You can't go alone, Nathan protested. It's suicide. I've been riding this land since before you were born, Ethan replied, his tone brooking no argument. I know every wash and gully, every hiding place. I'll find her. He transferred the evidence box to his own saddlebag, then swung into the saddle with a grace that belied his 62 years. If we're not back by sundown tomorrow, take that box to the county marshal in Austin. Not the sheriff here, he's in Reynolds' pocket. The marshal. Nathan recognized the futility of further argument. God go with you, he said simply. Ethan touched the brim of his hat in acknowledgement, then turned his horse westward, following Diablo's tracks back toward whatever danger had befallen Joe. Twilight found Joe huddled in a narrow crevice between limestone formations, listening to the sounds of Hayes's men still searching the rocky terrain. They had split up after following Diablo, half continuing after the horse, half staying behind to hunt for her. Hours had passed, and still they searched their determination, telling Joe exactly how important preventing the evidence from reaching authorities must be to Mason Reynolds and his allies. She shifted position carefully, trying to ease cramped muscles without making noise. The documents she'd kept with her crinkled against her skin, a reminder of Sarah, of promises made, of justice long denied. In the gathering darkness, Joe's thoughts turned to Ethan. Had Diablo reached the ranch? Had the evidence box been secured? Was Ethan even now organizing a search party, or was he following instructions to protect the documents above all else? She wouldn't blame him if he chose the latter. The evidence was what mattered, proof of crimes that had gone unpunished for 2 decades, proof that could save Whispering Pines from foreclosure. Her life was a small price to pay for such justice. The sound of approaching footsteps jolted Joe from these thoughts. Someone was very close, moving with deliberate stealth rather than the earlier crashing pursuit. She pressed herself further into the crevice, scarcely breathing. A shadow passed across the narrow opening, a man, rifle in hand, scanning the deepening gloom. The fading light glinted on his belt buckle, illuminating an ornate H design. Hayes himself, hunting her personally. He paused mere feet from her hiding place, so close Joe could see the scar bisecting his eyebrow, could smell the tobacco and whiskey that seemed permanently embedded in his clothes. I know you're out here, girl, he called, voice carrying in the twilight stillness. Your horse is long gone, probably halfway to Blackwoods by now. You've got nowhere to go. Joe remained motionless, willing her racing heart to quiet. It doesn't have to end badly. Hayes continued, scanning the rocks around him. Just tell me what was in that box. What evidence Sarah Blackwood supposedly had. So that was it. They weren't certain what the box contained. Joe's decision to split the contents had been wiser than she knew. Reynolds is willing to be reasonable. Hayes went on, moving a few steps away from Joe's hiding place. The bank forecloses. He gets the east section with the oil. Blackwood keeps the rest of the ranch. Everyone walks away. No need for unpleasantness about historical matters. Joe nearly laughed at the euphemism. Historical matters. As if Sarah's murder was merely an unfortunate footnote in county records. Last chance, Hayes called after another moment of silence. Come out now, tell us what we need to know, and you right away. Stay hidden, and when we find you, and we will, things get considerably less civilized. When no response came, he spat on the ground in disgust. Have it your way. He moved away, disappearing into the gathering darkness. Joe waited several minutes to ensure he was truly gone before allowing herself a silent exhale of relief. Night was falling rapidly now, the temperature dropping with the sun. Soon she would be able to move under cover of darkness, begin making her way back toward Whispering Pines. If she traveled all night, she might reach the ranch by dawn. First, though, she needed water. Her throat was parched from hours of silent, dusty hiding. The dry creek bed they'd crossed earlier had contained a few stagnant pools, not ideal, but better than nothing. Joe waited until full darkness had settled and the sounds of searchers had grown distant before easing out of her hiding place. Her muscles protested after hours of immobility, but she forced herself to move carefully, staying low and using rock formations for cover as she made her way back toward the creek bed. The night was clear stars emerging in a velvet sky, offering just enough light to navigate by once her eyes adjusted. The rocky terrain that had provided hiding places now became a treacherous obstacle course requiring careful foot placement to avoid noise or falls. It took nearly an hour to reach the creek bed. Joe slid down the bank, grateful for the relative concealment offered by the cottonwoods. The air was cooler here, carrying a hint of moisture that led her to a small pool of standing water caught in a depression in the creek bed. She knelt, cupping water in her hands to drink, then splashing some on her face to clear away dust and sweat. The simple act felt incredibly luxurious after the day's ordeal. A twig snapped nearby. Joe froze, water dripping from her chin, all senses suddenly alert. Had Hayes stationed a man at the water source, anticipating her need? She reached slowly for the revolver at her hip, eyes straining to penetrate the darkness beneath the cottonwoods. "Joe!" The whispered voice nearly stopped her heart, a voice she recognized, though she could scarcely believe it. "Ethan," she whispered back, hardly daring to hope. A figure materialized from the shadows, tall, familiar, moving with the careful grace of a lifetime spent reading Wild Country. "Thank God," Ethan breathed, closing the distance between them in 3 long strides. His hands gripped her shoulders, eyes searching her face in the dim starlight. "Are you hurt?" Joe shook her head, emotion constricting her throat. "Diablo. Made it home, with the box." Relief colored Ethan's voice. "What happened?" In terse whispers, Joe explained the ambush at the line shack, the pursuit, her decision to send Diablo ahead with the box, while keeping the most crucial documents on her person. "Hayes and his men are still searching," she finished. "They don't know exactly what evidence Sarah had. Reynolds is offering a deal, the east section for the oil, the rest of the ranch stays with you. No mention of historical matters." Ethan's expression hardened. 20 years they've gotten away with murder. They think they can bargain their way out of justice now. "They're desperate," Joe said. "And desperate men are dangerous," Ethan finished. "All the more reason to get you safely back to the ranch. I've got a horse hidden a 1/4 mile upstream. If we move carefully, we can be well away before Hayes realizes you've slipped through his fingers." They moved through the darkness like shadows, Ethan leading the way with the confidence of a man who knew every inch of the land beneath his feet. Joe followed close behind, the documents from Sarah's box pressed against her skin like a second heartbeat. The horse Ethan had brought, a sturdy dark bay, nickered softly in greeting as they approached its hiding place in a thicket of mesquite. "We'll ride double," Ethan said, helping Joe mount before swinging up behind her. "Stay low and quiet until we're well clear." The horse moved forward at Ethan's urging, picking its way carefully through the darkness. Joe leaned back slightly, drawing strength from Ethan's solid presence behind her, from his arms reaching around to hold the reins. They had almost reached the edge of the rocky terrain, the open prairie beyond, promising faster travel, when a voice shattered the night's silence. Well, what have we here?" Gavin Hayes stepped from behind a boulder, rifle aimed squarely at them. 2 of his men emerged from the shadows on either side, effectively boxing them in. "Blackwood," Hayes said, malice glinting in his eyes. "Should have known you'd come for your... What is she to you exactly, ranch hand, surrogate daughter, or something else entirely?" Ethan's arms tightened protectively around Joe. "Let us pass, Hayes. This doesn't concern you." "Oh, but it does." Hayes stepped closer, moonlight catching the cruel smile spreading across his face. "Reynolds is paying handsomely to recover certain items that don't belong to you. Items that might cause unnecessary trouble for prominent citizens." "Murder generally causes trouble for those who commit it," Ethan replied evenly. Hayes waved his hand dismissively. "Ancient history. No one cares about your freak sister anymore, Blackwood. But that oil under your land, people care about that." Joe felt Ethan tense behind her, knew how deeply Hayes's casual cruelty cut. But when he spoke, his voice remained steady. "The evidence is already on its way to Austin, to the marshal's office. You're too late." Uncertainty flickered across Hayes's face, the first chink in his confident facade. "You're bluffing. Nathan wouldn't leave the ranch undefended." "Who said anything about Nathan?" Ethan countered. "Martha left hours ago. Should be halfway to Austin by now." It was a lie Joe knew, but a convincing one. Hayes hesitated, clearly recalculating. "Even if that's true," he said finally, "it doesn't help your current situation. The 2 of you aren't going anywhere." Ethan leaned forward slightly, his voice dropping to a near whisper in Joe's ear. "When I move, kick free and run. Don't look back." Before Joe could protest, Ethan exploded into action. He heeled the horse sharply to the right, while simultaneously drawing his revolver, firing two quick shots that sent Hayes and his men diving for cover. "Go!" Ethan shouted, practically pushing Joe from the saddle as the horse reared in the confusion. Joe hit the ground hard, rolling with the impact. Gunshots cracked through the night air as Hayes's men returned fire. Through the chaos, she saw Ethan wheel the horse, drawing their attention as he galloped away. They were following Ethan, not her. He had made himself the target deliberately. For a moment, Joe remained frozen, torn between following Ethan's instruction to run and the desperate need to help him. Then training and survival instinct took over. She scrambled to her feet and ran, not away from the danger, but toward the horse belonging to one of Hayes's men tethered nearby. The animal was nervous from the gunfire, but Joe had a way with horses. She spoke softly, approaching from the front, hands gentle but confident as she untied the reins. "Easy, boy. We're going to help my friend." Mounting quickly, she turned the horse in the direction Ethan had fled, where gunshots still echoed through the night. She had no plan beyond the certainty that she couldn't leave Ethan to face Hayes alone. The terrain was treacherous in the darkness, but Joe urged the horse forward, following the sounds of pursuit. They crested a small rise just in time to see Ethan's horse stumble on the uneven ground ahead, sending its rider tumbling to the earth. Hayes and his men closed in their forms, black silhouettes against the star-strewn sky. "End of the trail, Blackwood," Hayes called, his voice carrying clearly in the night air. Joe didn't hesitate. She heeled her mount forward, charging down the slope toward the confrontation. Her borrowed revolver was in her hand, though she had little skill with it. "Hayes," she shouted, drawing their attention. "Let him go!" Surprise gave her a momentary advantage. Hayes and his men turned toward this new threat, momentarily forgetting Ethan, who lay prone on the ground. Joe fired the shot, going wild but causing Hayes's men to scatter. In the confusion, she saw Ethan struggle to his feet, his own revolver finding its mark. One of Hayes's men cried out, clutching his shoulder as he fell. The odds had shifted 2 against 3 now, and the element of surprise was on their side. Joe rode directly at Hayes, forcing him to dive aside. She circled back, putting herself between Ethan and their attackers. "Enough!" Hayes shouted, his earlier confidence replaced by frustrated rage. "You're only delaying the inevitable, Blackwood. The bank takes your ranch in 2 weeks, evidence or no evidence." "The law might have something to say about that," Ethan replied, his voice strained but resolute. "Once they see proof of your father's involvement in Sarah's death, once they understand the lengths Reynolds has gone to for that oil." Something shifted in Hayes's expression, a flicker of doubt or perhaps a more complex emotion. "My father was a good man," he said, but his tone lacked conviction. "Your father helped kill an innocent woman," Ethan countered. "Just like you're trying to do now. The apple doesn't fall far from the tree, does it?" The words struck home. Hayes' face contorted with a mixture of anger and something that might have been shame. For a moment, Joe thought he might order his men to open fire regardless of the consequences. Instead, he lowered his rifle slightly. "This isn't over, Blackwood. Reynolds won't let it end here." "No," Ethan agreed. "But it's over for tonight. Take your wounded man and go before I decide justice is better served immediately." A tense standoff followed, neither side willing to be the first to back down. Finally, Hayes jerked his head at his remaining man. "Get Williams on his horse. We're leaving." As they helped their wounded companion mount, Hayes turned back to Joe and Ethan. "Don't think this changes anything. That evidence won't save you, not when half the county government has a stake in keeping it buried." "We'll take our chances with the law," Ethan replied steadily. Hayes' laugh held no humor. The law is whoever has the most money or the most guns, Blackwood. Always has been." With that parting shot, he mounted his horse and rode away, his men following, one supported by the other as blood darkened his sleeve. Joe dismounted quickly, rushing to Ethan's side. In the pale moonlight, his face was drawn with pain, one arm held awkwardly against his side. "You're hurt," she said, helping him sit on a nearby rock. "Took a bad fall when the horse stumbled," Ethan admitted, wincing as he tried to straighten. "Nothing broken, I don't think. Just bruised pride and an old man's aching bones." Relief flooded through Joe. She'd been certain, seeing him fall, that Hayes would kill him without hesitation. "You could have been killed," she said, unable to keep the accusation from her voice. "Drawing them off like that." Ethan's eyes met hers, unwavering in the starlight. "Better me than you." The simple statement hung between them, laden with meaning beyond its 4 words. Joe looked away first, overwhelmed by the depth of feeling it revealed. "Can you ride?" she asked, changing the subject to practical matters. "We should get back to the ranch before Hayes changes his mind." Ethan nodded, accepting her help to stand. "I can ride. though I might need you to help me stay in the saddle if I start to doze off." They recovered Ethan's horse, which had stopped some distance away once relieved of its rider. Together, they started the long journey back to Whispering Pines, riding side by side through the star-washed Texas night. Neither spoke much, the shared ordeal and narrow escape having created a silence more eloquent than words. Occasionally their eyes would meet, confirming the other's presence, drawing strength from the connection that had deepened through danger, survived together. By the time the first hint of dawn lightened the eastern horizon, the familiar silhouette of the ranch house came into view, a beacon of safety in a world suddenly revealed as more dangerous than either had imagined. Nathan was waiting on the porch, rifle across his knees, exhaustion evident in the slump of his shoulders. At the sight of two riders approaching, he rose, squinting into the pre-dawn gloom until recognition dawned. "They're back," he called over his shoulder. Martha appeared in the doorway, a shawl clutched around her nightdress, her face transforming from worry to joy. As they rode into the yard, the full household emerged to greet them. Nathan, Martha, and the handful of loyal ranch hands who had stood guard through the night. Their relieved faces told Joe everything about the anxiety their absence had caused. Ethan dismounted stiffly, his injuries making the simple action a study in carefully controlled pain. Joe was at his side, instantly supporting him as Nathan hurried forward to help. "What happened?" Nathan demanded, taking in their exhausted state, the dust and occasional bloodstains on their clothing. "We feared the worst." "Later," Ethan said, fatigue evident in his voice. "First, is the evidence safe?" Nathan nodded. "Locked in your desk just as you left it. No one's come near the ranch." "And Eleanor Reynolds, any word?" A shadow crossed Nathan's face. "Nothing. No sign of her at all." Joe and Ethan exchanged concerned glances. Had Eleanor been prevented from reaching the meeting, intercepted by her husband or his allies, or had she betrayed them? Setting up the ambush at the line shack. "We'll worry about that later," Martha declared, taking charge in her practical way. "Both of you need food, clean clothes, and rest. The world's troubles will wait a few hours." She was right, of course. Whatever the coming days held, they would face it better with basic needs addressed. Joe helped Ethan into the house, settling him in his study where Martha could tend to his injuries, while she herself retreated to Sarah's blue room to change out of dust-covered clothes. As Joe unbuttoned her shirt, the documents she'd carried next to her skin fell to the floor. Sarah's journal, Sophia's confession, the maps marking properties seized through corrupt dealings. She gathered them reverently, placing them on the small writing desk by the window. They had come so close to losing everything, the evidence, the ranch, even their lives. Yet somehow, they had survived, the precious proof of long-ago crimes intact, the chance for justice still alive. Joe sank onto the bed, suddenly overwhelmed by exhaustion. She would rest just for a moment before joining the others downstairs. Sleep claimed her instantly, deep and dreamless, the sleep of the utterly spent. And for once, no ghosts walked through her dreams, no voices called from the past. Perhaps even Sarah's restless spirit had found a measure of peace in the knowledge that justice long deferred might finally be at hand. The question of Eleanor Reynolds was answered unexpectedly the following day. Joe and Ethan were in the study carefully organizing Sarah's evidence for presentation to the county marshal, when the sound of an approaching buggy brought them both to the window. A fine black vehicle with gleaming brass fittings came into view, driven by a woman whose dark hair was pinned beneath a modest hat. Beside her sat another woman, heavily veiled, her posture rigid with what might have been fear or determination. "Eleanor," Joe breathed, recognizing the driver. "But who's with her?" Ethan stared at the veiled figure, his expression shifting to one of disbelief. "I think," he said slowly, "that might be Sophia." It seemed impossible. Sophia Reynolds, Sarah's lover, the woman whose silence had allowed her father and his associates to escape justice for 20 years. Yet as the buggy drew closer, something in the veiled woman's bearing and the tilt of her head sparked a distant memory in Ethan's eyes. They moved to the porch as the buggy stopped in the yard. Eleanor assisted her companion to descend, supporting her with a daughter's gentle care. The veiled woman moved with the careful steps of someone either elderly or infirm. "Mr. Blackwood," Eleanor called, her voice carrying a mix of urgency and apology. "Forgive our intrusion. We couldn't come to the line shack. Mother was too ill. I sent a ranch hand to warn you, but he returned saying Hayes's men had the place surrounded." Ethan descended the porch steps slowly, his gaze never leaving the veiled figure. "Mrs. Reynolds," he acknowledged. "And?" The veiled woman lifted her hands, trembling visibly even from a distance, and pulled back the black lace concealing her face. Sophia Reynolds had once been beautiful, that much was evident even through the ravages of time and what appeared to be serious illness. Her face was gaunt skin stretched taut over elegant bones, but her eyes, the same eyes Eleanor had inherited, remained vividly alive in her wasted features. "Ethan," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "It's been a long time." For a moment, Ethan seemed unable to respond, frozen by the apparition of his sister's lover suddenly materialized after decades. Then with visible effort, he gathered himself. 20 years, 2 months and 16 days, he said precisely, since Sarah was buried. Sophia flinched as if struck, but she didn't look away. "Yes, since I lost everything that mattered." Joe moved to Ethan's side, offering silent support. Eleanor kept a protective arm around her mother, watching the exchange with anxious eyes. "Perhaps we should go inside," Joe suggested gently. "This conversation shouldn't be had in the yard." The parlor, that formal room so rarely used, became the setting for a reckoning 20 years in the making. Sophia sat on the same settee where Mason had delivered his threats weeks earlier, her daughter beside her, a shawl wrapped around shoulders too thin for her elegant dress. Ethan took his usual chair, his face composed, but for the slight muscle twitching in his jaw. Joe stood behind him, one hand resting lightly on the back of his chair, a reminder of presence, of solidarity. "I'm dying," Sophia said without preamble, her directness startling after the stilted formality of their greeting. "Consumption. The doctors give me perhaps a month." Ethan's expression remained neutral. "I'm sorry for your suffering." "Are you?" Her smile held no warmth. "After what I did, or rather failed to do, I would expect nothing but hatred from you." "My sister loved you," Ethan replied simply. "That earns you the courtesy of basic human compassion, whatever else lies between us." Sophia's composure wavered, her eyes brightening with unshed tears. "She shouldn't have loved me. I wasn't worthy of it." "No," Ethan agreed, his voice cool. "You weren't." "Father," Eleanor protested, but Sophia silenced her with a gentle touch. "He's right, my dear. I wasn't worthy. Sarah was brave and true, and I was a coward." She turned back to Ethan, gathering strength for what she had come to say. "I watched them kill her, Ethan. My father, Mason's father, Old Man Hayes, and 2 others. I watched from the trees, too terrified to intervene, too weak to even cry out." The blunt confession hung in the air like a thunderclap. Joe felt Ethan's shoulder tense beneath her hand. "And afterward," he asked, his voice dangerously quiet, "when they called it suicide, when they buried the truth along with her body." Sophia's chin lifted slightly, dignity asserting itself through her shame. "I wrote it all down. Every detail, every name. I gave the letter to Sarah's friend, the stable master." "Nathan," Joe murmured. "Yes, Nathan. He promised to hide it somewhere, only the right person would find it." Her gaze shifted to Joe, assessment in her eyes. "I see he kept his word." Joe nodded. "We found it, along with Sarah's journal and the evidence she collected against your father and his associates. Evidence which nearly got Joe killed," Ethan added pointedly. "Hayes and his men ambushed her at the line shack where Eleanor was supposed to meet her." Eleanor's face paled. "I swear I sent warning. I had no idea they would—" "It wasn't Eleanor's fault," Sophia interrupted. "It was mine. I insisted on coming on seeing Whispering Pines one last time before—" She gestured vaguely at her frail form. "My weakness delayed us, gave Mason time to grow suspicious." "How much does he know?" Joe asked. "About the evidence, about what really happened to Sarah?" "He knows everything," Sophia said bitterly. "I told him myself years ago during a particularly brutal argument. He didn't believe me at first, thought it was a wife's spiteful invention. Then Sarah's evidence started surfacing through Nathan, and he realized the danger. That's why he's so desperate to foreclose on the ranch," Ethan realized. "Not just for the oil, but to bury the past once and for all." Sophia inclined her head in agreement. "The oil makes it profitable, but silencing the truth is his true motivation." She leaned forward slightly, intensity lending strength to her wasted frame. "That's why I'm here, Ethan. To add my testimony to Sarah's evidence, to ensure that this time the truth is heard." Ethan studied her for a long moment, measuring her sincerity against 2 decades of silence. "Why now? Why not years ago, before her killers prospered, before some died peacefully in their beds without facing justice?" "Because I was a coward," Sophia answered simply. "Because I valued safety and comfort over truth. Because I feared what my father and husband would do to me, and later to Eleanor, if I spoke out." Her gaze dropped to her lap, where her thin fingers twisted together. "I have no excuses, only regrets. But I can't die with this still unspoken. I can't face Sarah and whatever comes after without having done this much at least. The raw honesty in her voice seemed to reach Ethan where carefully crafted explanations might have failed. Some of the rigid tension left his shoulders, replaced by a weariness that spoke of burdens carried too long. Your testimony will help, he acknowledged. But it may not be enough. The men involved are powerful with connections throughout the county. Not in Austin, Eleanor interjected. The state authorities aren't under my husband's influence, and there's more. She reached into her reticule, withdrawing a thick envelope. Financial records proving how the foreclosures were engineered, how my father-in-law manipulated water rights and cattle prices to specifically target Whispering Pines and other properties along the oil seam. Joe accepted the envelope, adding it to the growing collection of evidence on the side table. This could make the difference between being heard and being dismissed. It will cost you, Ethan warned, looking at Eleanor. Your marriage, your position in society, possibly your safety? Eleanor straightened, resolve flashing in her eyes. My marriage was arranged to unite two fortunes, not two hearts. As for society, I've watched it protect murderers and persecute the innocent. I can live without its approval. And you? Ethan turned to Sophia, his gaze unflinching. Are you prepared for what this will mean, for the scandal, the potential repercussions, even if you won't live to see them fully realized? Sophia met his eyes directly. I've lived with shame for 20 years, Ethan. Truth, however painful, will be a relief by comparison. She paused, then added softly, I loved her, you know. Not enough to save her, but with all the courage I possessed at the time. Something in Ethan's face softened at these words, not forgiveness exactly, but perhaps the first step toward understanding. Sarah loved completely without reservation, he said quietly. It was her gift, and her vulnerability. She'd be proud of you, Sophia replied, her gaze taking in the modest parlor, the evidence of years spent protecting her memory, of how you've kept faith with her. An unexpected noise from the doorway interrupted this fragile moment of connection. Martha stood there, her normally composed features tight with alarm. Riders coming, she announced tersely. At least a dozen, Hayes leading them and Mason Reynolds beside him. Ethan was on his feet, instantly moving to the window. In the distance, a cloud of dust marked the approaching horsemen, still perhaps 10 minutes away. They're coming for the evidence, he said grimly, and to silence Sophia before she can testify. Eleanor moved protectively closer to her mother. How did they know we were here? Someone must have seen your buggy, recognized it, Joe suggested, or they've had the ranch watched since the line shack incident. Ethan's mind was already moving to practical matters. Nathan, he called. The ranch manager appeared instantly, clearly having anticipated the summons. I've already sent the boys to defensive positions, he reported. 6 of us all armed, but 12 against 6, not good odds. 14, Joe corrected, determination in her voice. I can shoot if I must, and so can Ethan. 15, Martha added firmly. I handled a rifle during the Comanche raids of '56. I haven't forgotten how. Ethan acknowledged these additions with a nod. We don't need to win, just hold them off long enough for the evidence to get away. He turned to Joe. Take Diablo. He's the fastest horse we have. Ride for Austin for the marshal's office. Take everything, Sarah's journal, Sophia's letter, Eleanor's documents. Joe's eyes widened. Leave you to face them alone? No, I won't. This isn't a debate. Ethan interrupted, his tone leaving no room for argument. Sarah's truth is what matters. Getting justice for her after all these years. The ranch, the oil, none of it means anything without that. But, Joe, Ethan gripped her shoulders, his gaze intense. I need to know you're safe. I need to know Sarah's evidence is safe, please. The naked emotion in his voice silenced further protest. Joe nodded, throat too tight for words. I'll go with her, Eleanor offered. My testimony will add weight to the documents, and I know the quickest routes to Austin. No, Sophia said with surprising firmness. You stay, Eleanor. Help defend the ranch. I'll go with Joe. At their startled looks, she smiled faintly. I may be dying, but I can still sit a horse. And who would suspect 2 women traveling together? It might buy precious time. Ethan considered briefly, then nodded. Martha helped Sophia change into something less conspicuous. Joe gathered everything into saddlebags. Nathan prepared Diablo and the gray mare for hard riding. As the parlor emptied, each person moving with purposeful haste to their assigned task, Ethan caught Joe's arm. For a moment, words seemed to fail him. Then, with a gentleness that belied his weather-beaten exterior, he pressed something into her hand. It was Sarah's carved wooden horse, the childish talisman Martha had given Joe before the line shack journey. Come back, Ethan said simply. Whatever happens, find your way back here. Joe's fingers closed around the small carving, its smooth wood warm against her palm. "I will," she promised. "This is home now." The admission hung between them, fragile yet powerful. Ethan's hand lifted, brushing a strand of hair from Joe's face with a tenderness that needed no words. Then the moment broke as Nathan called from outside, announcing the horses were ready. There was no time for proper goodbyes for all the things that remained unspoken between them. Only the promise contained in that simple wooden horse and the determination to return to make good on it. 20 minutes later, as Mason Reynolds and Gavin Hayes led their men into the yard of Whispering Pines, they found Ethan Blackwood waiting calmly on the porch rifle across his knees. Behind him, Eleanor Reynolds stood in the doorway, her posture straight, her gaze unflinching as it met her husband's shocked recognition. What they didn't find was any sign of Joe Harlan's Sophia Reynolds, or the evidence that could destroy the foundations of power they had built on 20 years of lies and corruption. Those were already miles away, carried by two determined women riding hard toward Austin and the justice that had waited far too long. Behind them, the first shots rang out at Whispering Pines, the opening salvo in a battle whose outcome would determine whether Sarah's truth would finally be heard or whether it would be buried once again beneath violence and greed. The journey to Austin was grueling. Joe set a punishing pace, constantly checking behind them for pursuers. Sophia never complained, though the strain showed in the tightness around her mouth, the pallor of her already gaunt face. When they stopped briefly to rest the horses, Joe would find her doubled over with racking coughs that left specks of blood on her handkerchief. "We can slow down," Joe offered during one such stop 2 days into their journey. "Find a doctor." Sophia straightened with visible effort. "No," she said firmly. "There's no time and nothing a doctor can do for me now. The only medicine I need is justice." They reached Austin on the third day, travel-worn and exhausted. The state capitol sprawled along the Colorado River, a mix of ambitious new construction and frontier practicality. The Capitol building dominated the skyline, its limestone walls gleaming in the afternoon sun. The marshal's office was located in a solid brick building near the courthouse. Marshal James Hollister, a tall man with iron-gray hair and the watchful eyes of someone who had seen too much of human nature, listened in growing stillness as Joe and Sophia presented their case and the evidence that supported it. When they finished, he sat back in his chair, fingers steepled before him. "This is extraordinary," he said finally. "Murder, corruption, land theft spanning decades and implicating some of the most powerful men in Oak Ridge County. Will you help us?" Joe asked directly. Hollister's gaze was measuring. "Justice isn't always straightforward, Miss Harlan, especially when dealing with entrenched power. My sister died for this truth," Sophia said, her voice surprisingly strong despite her weakened state. "I'm dying myself. We don't have time for political calculations, Marshal." Something in her blunt assessment seemed to reach him. He leaned forward, decision made. "I'll dispatch riders immediately to Whispering Pines and to collect Judge Wilson from San Antonio. He's honest to a fault and owes me a favor." He stood, already moving toward action. "Stay here. Rest. You've done your part carrying this truth to us. Now let the law carry it forward." The next 24 hours passed in a blur of activity. Riders were dispatched, telegrams sent. Sophia was settled in the marshal's own home, tended by his wife, a former nurse with a no-nonsense manner and kind hands. Joe paced, slept fitfully, and worried about Ethan and the others at Whispering Pines. Had they survived the attack? Was the ranch still standing? The answer came with the dawn of their third day in Austin. Hoofbeats in the street brought Joe rushing to the window. A dust-covered rider was dismounting at the marshal's office. Something in his tall, lanky frame was achingly familiar. "Nathan," Joe called, rushing outside. The old ranch manager turned, his weathered face splitting in a rare wide smile at the sight of her. "You made it," he said, relief evident in his voice. "Thank God." "Ethan?" Joe asked, heart in her throat. "The others?" "Alive," Nathan assured her quickly. "Roughed up some, but alive. Reynolds and Hayes didn't expect us to be ready for them, or for Eleanor to stand with us." "What happened?" "They demanded we surrender you and the evidence. When Ethan refused, they opened fire." Nathan removed his hat, revealing a bandage above his left ear. "We held them off from the house for nearly an hour. Then the strangest thing happened. Hayes's men started arguing among themselves. Turns out some of them didn't sign up for murder, just intimidation." "And Hayes Reynolds?" "Reynolds fled when it was clear they couldn't take the ranch quickly. Hayes..." Nathan paused, something complex crossing his face. "Hayes stayed. even after his men began to desert. In the end, it was just him facing Ethan across the yard. "What happened?" Joe repeated, barely breathing. "They talked. I couldn't hear what was said, but when it was over, Hayes rode away alone." Nathan shook his head, still puzzled. Ethan wouldn't say what passed between them, just that some debts can only be paid one way, and Hayes had chosen his path. Marshal Hollister appeared from his office, purpose in his stride. "Stone," he acknowledged Nathan. "I've got a dozen men assembled. Judge Wilson arrives by train this afternoon. We ride for Oak Ridge at dawn tomorrow." Nathan nodded. "Ethan sent me ahead to make sure you got the evidence, and to bring Joe home." Home. The word resonated in Joe's chest like the vibration of a church bell. Whispering Pines was still standing. Ethan was waiting. But there was one more task to complete first. Judge Wilson, a stern man with a reputation for incorruptibility, convened a special hearing the following morning. Joe, Sophia, and Eleanor, who had arrived with a second group of riders from the ranch, testified to what they knew. The evidence, Sarah's journal. Sophia's confession, the financial records Eleanor had provided, was presented and entered into record. By midday, the judge had issued warrants for the arrest of Mason Reynolds, Gavin Hayes, and 3 other men implicated in the conspiracy to murder Sarah Blackwood and illegally seize land for oil speculation. "What happens now?" Joe asked Marshal Hollister as they prepared to depart for Oak Ridge. "Justice," he said simply. "Long delayed but finally served. My men will execute the warrants. The guilty will face trial, and Whispering Pines will remain in Blackwood hands where it belongs. Sophia, too weak now to travel, would remain in Austin under the care of the marshal's wife." As Joe said goodbye, the older woman pressed something into her hand, a locket containing a faded photograph of Sarah Blackwood young and smiling, her eyes bright with life. "Tell Ethan," Sophia whispered, "that I kept this close to my heart every day for 20 years. Tell him I'm sorry it took me so long to find my courage." Joe tucked the locket carefully away. "I will," she promised. The journey back to Whispering Pines seemed both endless and too swift. Joe rode at the front of the marshal's company, anxious to see what awaited them. As they crested the final rise and the ranch came into view, her heart leapt at the sight of a lone figure standing on the porch, tall, straight-backed, waiting. "Ethan." She urged Diablo forward, outpacing the others, closing the distance between them with every beat of the horse's hooves. When she reached the yard, she didn't wait for the horse to stop completely before dismounting, stumbling slightly in her haste. Ethan was there to catch her arm, steadying her. His face was bruised on one side, a bandage visible at his collar, but his eyes held a light she had never seen before. "You came back," he said simply. Joe nodded, finding it hard to speak past the tightness in her throat. Instead, she reached into her pocket and pressed Sarah's wooden horse back into his hand. "I promised." His fingers closed around hers, warm and calloused. "What happened in Austin?" "Justice," Joe said, echoing the marshal's words. "The warrants are issued. Reynolds, Hayes, all of them, they'll answer for what they did." A complex emotion crossed Ethan's face, not quite joy, but something deeper. Peace, perhaps. The easing of a burden carried too long. "And Sophia?" he asked. "Staying in Austin. She's too ill to travel." Joe hesitated, then added gently, "She won't see the trial, Ethan. Her time is too short." He absorbed this with a slow nod, grief and understanding mingling in his eyes. "Did she have a message for me?" Joe took out the locket, pressing it into his hand alongside the wooden horse. "She kept this close to her heart every day. She's sorry it took so long to find her courage." Ethan stared down at the small golden oval thumb tracing its surface. Without opening it, he seemed to know who it contained. "Tell her," he said finally, "when you write, that Sarah would understand, that I understand." The marshal's men were dismounting around them now, the yard filling with activity. There would be statements to give, paperwork to complete, a long process of justice to unfold in the days ahead. But in this moment, standing together on the porch of the home they had fought to protect, none of that seemed to matter. "What happens now?" Joe asked, echoing her question to the marshal. "To the ranch, to the oil?" "The bank can't foreclose, not with Reynolds facing charges of fraud and conspiracy." Ethan's gaze swept across his land, taking in the modest herd of cattle, the fields ready for planting, the creek that meandered toward the eastern boundary. "As for the oil, I've been thinking about that. And Sarah loved that creek bend, but she loved this land more. She wouldn't want it to wither away out of sentiment." A small smile touched Ethan's lips. "Besides, I suspect she'd appreciate the irony of using Reynolds' precious oil to make Whispering Pines thrive again." Joe returned his smile, understanding. A controlled drilling operation, just enough to secure the ranch's future, but preserving Sarah's special places. Exactly. Ethan hesitated, then added with careful casualness, "It'll take someone with a good head for business to manage it, someone who can read contracts and negotiate terms. Someone who knows their letters." Joe supplied warmth spreading through her chest at his implied meaning. "Someone who belongs here," he finished, his eyes meeting hers directly. "Someone who's come home." The word hung between them, no longer fragile, but strong, a foundation to build upon. "Home," Joe agreed softly, "for as long as you'll have me." Ethan's hand found hers again, a gesture that spoke volumes in its simple certainty. That would be for always, Joe Harlan. That would be for always. 1 year later, the oak tree in the small cemetery cast dappled shadows across the graves beneath it. The old stones remained, but now a third marker stood beside them, a simple cross for Sophia Reynolds, who had passed peacefully in Austin 3 weeks after delivering her testimony, her conscience finally at peace. Sarah's grave had changed as well. The weathered stone with its brief epitaph had been replaced by a larger marker, this one bearing not only her name and dates, but words that spoke of who she truly had been. Sarah Blackwood, 1850 to 1872, beloved sister friend and truth seeker, who lived as herself and showed others the way. Joe stood before it, a bouquet of wildflowers in her hand, the same varieties that had always grown here seemingly of their own accord. Beside her, Ethan watched as she arranged them carefully against the stone. "She would have liked you," he said quietly. Stubborn as she was, brave in the same ways. Joe smiled, thinking of the woman she had never met, but whose life had somehow shaped her own. "I think I would have liked her too." The past year had transformed Whispering Pines. The cattle herd had doubled, new hands had been hired. The house had received a fresh coat of paint, and the broken porch railing had finally been properly replaced. In the east section, a single oil derrick stood as a compromise between past and future, providing enough income to secure the ranch's prosperity without despoiling the land Sarah had loved. Mason Reynolds was serving 20 years in the state penitentiary. Judge Taylor had been removed from the bench. Most of the other conspirators had accepted plea arrangements in exchange for testimony, and Gavin Hayes, he had disappeared the day after the confrontation at Whispering Pines. Some said he'd headed to California. Others claimed he joined the army under an assumed name. Whatever the truth, he had chosen exile over prosecution, carrying his father's sins and his own into whatever new life he had found. Joe and Ethan turned from the graves, walking side by side back toward the house. Their relationship had evolved over the months, from employer and employee to partners in the ranch, to something deeper that needed no formal definition. The blue room was still Joe's, but she spent less and less time there, gradually moving her belongings to the master bedroom, where Ethan had once shared a life with Margaret. No one at Whispering Pines questioned this arrangement. The hands treated Joe with the respect due to the ranch's co-owner, addressing her as Miss Joe, regardless of whether she wore trousers or the occasional skirt she had adopted for trips into town. In the wider community, there were whispers, of course, but the combination of newfound wealth and the vindication of Ethan's long-held claims about Sarah's death had created a buffer of respectability that few dared challenge. As they reached the porch, Nathan rode in from the east section, dust coating his clothes, but satisfaction evident in his expression. "Well," Ethan asked, already knowing the answer from the old man's face. "Third well's a gusher," Nathan confirmed, dismounting stiffly. "Not huge, but steady. Should more than cover the new breeding stock you wanted?" Joe smiled, calculating figures in her head. "And the school for the Hands children, and maybe finally replacing that leaky roof on the bunkhouse." Nathan chuckled, a rare sound that had become more common in recent months. "Always thinking ahead, aren't you, Miss Joe?" "Someone has to," she returned with mock severity. "Since you two would let this place fall apart around your ears if it meant saving $1. Their friendly bickering continued as they entered the house, where Martha was preparing a celebration dinner in honor of the new well. The kitchen was warm and fragrant, filled with the sounds of cooking and conversation. Through the window, the setting sun painted the western sky in shades of amber and gold, promising another fair day tomorrow. Outside, beneath the oak tree, wildflowers nodded gently in the evening breeze. And if in certain lights or at certain times a figure sometimes seemed to stand there, a woman with Sarah Blackwood's features and knowing smile, well, that was just a trick of shadow and memory. A reminder that some spirits linger not out of restlessness, but out of love. Justice had been served. Truth had prevailed. And in its wake, a new family had formed from the fragments of the old, bound not by blood, but by choice, by shared struggle, by the promise of a future built on honesty and acceptance. For Jo Harlan, who had spent so much of her life running, it was more than enough. It was everything. It was home.